Tonight's stories come from two experienced truck drivers, men who had spent years learning how to stay safe on the road and believed they could recognize trouble before it reached them. In our first story, an owner-operator leaves a crowded truck stop in El Paso after a brief encounter with a stranger. But as he travels deeper into the empty West Texas desert, small details begin to feel wrong. Each one has a perfectly reasonable explanation, until he realizes that the greatest danger on the highway may be much closer than it appears. Then, in our second story, a veteran trucker spends the night in an isolated overflow lot outside Amarillo. During the night, he hears something near his tractor, but by morning, everything seems normal. However, one routine habit, a habit other drivers have mocked him for, prevents him from making a mistake he would have carried with him for the rest of his life. Both of these drivers had years of experience, both followed rules designed to keep them alive, and both discovered that sometimes the most terrifying threats are the ones waiting just outside your field of view. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next story. You can also follow the Just Creepy podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, leaving a rating or review is one of the best ways to help the show grow and reach more listeners. Now, turn down the lights, lock your doors, and settle in. My name doesn't matter much for this. What matters is that I've been an owner-operator for 11 years. I run a 2015 Kenworth with a 76-inch sleeper, and on the night this happened, I was hauling 44,000 pounds of aluminum coils out of El Paso, headed east on Interstate 10 toward a rolling mill outside of San Antonio. I want to say up front that I'm not the nervous type. You can't be, doing this job. I've had people bang on my door at 3 in the morning at rest areas outside of Gary, Indiana. I've had a guy try to climb my catwalk at a light in Memphis. I've been followed off an exit ramp in Louisiana by a car with no plates that turned around the second I pulled into a way station. 11 years of that teaches you a certain flatness. You lock your doors, you park under lights, you keep your head moving, and you don't make a story out of every strange thing you see, because if you did, you'd never sleep again. But I'm going to tell you about the night of October 9th, and I'm going to tell it in order, exactly the way it happened, because the order matters. Every single thing I noticed that night, I explained away in the moment, every one. And I want you to hear how reasonable each of those explanations sounded, so you understand how a careful man with 11 years behind the wheel ended up doing 70 miles an hour through West Texas with another human being breathing quietly 6 feet behind his head. First, the truck. This part is important. My sleeper has an exterior luggage compartment on the passenger side, down low, beneath the bunk. It's a storage box, basically. Big enough for a couple of duffel bags, my tire chains, a case of oil. The door on it is about 2 feet wide and maybe 18 inches tall, hinged at the bottom with a key latch. Back in August, somebody had pried at that latch in a lot outside of Tucson. They didn't get in, but they bent the mechanism, and I had it repaired at a shop in Phoenix. The repair was fine except for one thing. The latch didn't always catch. If you closed the door soft, it would look shut. It would even feel shut if you gave it a light tug, but it wasn't locked. You had to slam it. I knew this. I'd been slamming it for 2 months. I had a note on my phone that said get luggage latch fixed right, and it had been sitting there since Labor Day, because the door still technically closed, and I always have something more urgent to spend money on. Inside the sleeper, under the bunk, there's a panel between the mattress platform and that luggage compartment. It's a piece of pressed board, with insulation behind it, held in with plastic push fasteners. It separates the storage box from the interior. In most trucks, you'd never think about it. In mine, 2 of the fasteners had gone missing years ago, and the panel sat loose in its frame. You could pull the bottom edge towards you and see daylight through to the luggage box. I knew that too. I'd stuffed a moving blanket back there once and watched it slump through the gap. So, a luggage door that didn't always latch, and a loose panel behind it. Keep both of those in your head. I delivered a load in El Paso on the afternoon of the 9th and picked up the coils at a yard off Zaragoza Road around 5 in the evening. My appointment in San Antonio was for 10 the next morning, which gave me all night to run 550 miles. Easy. I planned to drive to Fort Stockton, sleep 6 or 7 hours, and roll in with time to spare. Before leaving town, I stopped at a big truck stop on the east side of El Paso to fuel, eat, and shower. If you've run Interstate 10 through there, you know the place. On a weeknight it's crowded, and that night it was worse than usual. Every fuel lane had a line. The lot was full and trucks were staged along the fence waiting for spots. Inside, the restaurant had a 20-minute wait and the shower list was 9 deep. Normal chaos. I fueled, moved the truck to a spot near the back of the lot, and walked in to put my name on the shower board. I was walking back out to wait in the truck when the woman in the pink sweatshirt came up to me. She was young, early 20s if I had to guess. Pink hooded sweatshirt, jeans, white sneakers that were clean, which I noticed because everything at a truck stop gets filthy and hers hadn't yet. She had a small backpack over one shoulder. No suitcase, no bags, no jacket even though the sun was down and the desert cools off fast in October. She stopped about 8 feet from me, which I remember thinking was polite spacing, and she asked if I was heading east. I said I was. She told me her boyfriend had left her there. She said they'd been driving to Van Horn. They got in a fight at the pumps, and he drove off with her phone still charging in the car. She said she'd been walking the lot for an hour asking drivers, and everybody kept saying no, and she just needed to get to Van Horn. It was only 2 hours. Her sister lived there, and she'd sit quiet and wouldn't touch anything. I want to describe how she said it, because this is the part I keep going back over. She wasn't crying. Her voice didn't shake. She told the whole thing in a smooth, even way, and when she got to the part about the boyfriend taking her phone, she looked off toward the interstate for a second, and then back at me. It was a good telling. It hit every point a true story would hit. And I remember a small, quiet flag going up in the back of my head, not because anything was wrong with the story, but because nothing was. People who've actually been stranded tell it messy. They back up, they repeat things, they're angry at the wrong parts. Hers came out in order, front to back, and it landed on the ask at the end, clean and rehearsed. But honestly, that flag was faint, and it wasn't why I said no. I said no because I say no to everybody. My insurance doesn't cover passengers. My authority doesn't allow unauthorized riders. And 11 years has taught me that nothing good has ever once come from letting a stranger into my truck. It's the simplest rule I have. I told her I couldn't take riders, but that the store had security inside, and the manager could call the sheriff's office or a shelter service, and I'd walk in with her and get that going right then. I even took a step toward the building when I said it. And here's the second thing I keep going back over. The moment I said the word security, she was done with me. Not angry, not embarrassed, done. She said something under her breath, thanks anyway, or something in that shape, turned, and walked off between the fuel lanes at a pace that was faster than a stranded person walks. A stranded person with no phone and no ride has nowhere to be. She had somewhere to be. I stood there for a second, then went inside anyway and mentioned it to the guy at the fuel desk. Young woman, pink sweatshirt, asking drivers for rides, might need help, or might be working the lot. He nodded, and wrote nothing down, and that was about what I expected. Lot lizards, panhandlers, stranded people, runaways, they see all of it every night, and there's only so much a fuel clerk can do. I skipped the shower. The list was too long, and I wanted miles. I bought a sandwich and 2 coffees, one for now and one for the road, walked back to my truck, did my usual walk around, and this is the detail that will bother me for the rest of my life. I checked the luggage compartment door on the walk around. I always do. I put my hand on it and gave it a tug, and it held, and I moved on to thumping my tires. It held. That's all a tug ever told me. I knew the latch was bad. I knew it needed a slam. I'd slammed it that morning in El Paso, after getting my chains out to move them for the scale, and I could not tell you, then or now, whether I slammed it hard enough. The tug said it was closed. The tug always said it was closed. I pulled out of the lot at 7:50 in the evening and got on Interstate 10 eastbound with about 550 miles between me and my delivery and a full dark coming down over the desert. East of El Paso, Interstate 10 empties out fast. You clear the city, you clear the outlet malls, and the last of the billboards, and then it's just you, the freight, and 80-some miles of nothing before Sierra Blanca, creosote flats, mountains sitting black against the last of the light, and a string of taillights ahead of you that thins out mile by mile until you can count them. I ran the first hour without incident, passed through the Border Patrol checkpoint east of town, got waved through, settled in at 67 with the cruise on. I had a talk radio station out of El Paso fading in and out, and when it finally dissolved into static somewhere around the Fort Hancock exits, I shut it off and rode quiet. I do a lot of my driving quiet. After enough years, the engine is the radio. Around 9 o'clock, I pulled into a little fuel station near Sierra Blanca. Not the big travel centers, one of the small independent places. I didn't need fuel. I needed the restroom, and my second coffee had gone cold, and there's a microwave in that store I've used before. In and out, 5 minutes. I was walking back across the lot with my coffee when I saw her. Pink sweatshirt, same backpack. She was standing at the edge of the lot near the air pumps, and she was talking to a man beside a white cargo van. I stopped walking. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. 88 miles from where she'd been stranded with no phone and no ride, and here she was, an hour and change later, standing in the dark at a fuel stop in Sierra Blanca. Somebody had given her that ride. Fine. Drivers say no all night until somebody says yes. But the man she was talking to didn't read as a good Samaritan dropping somebody off. He was older, 50s maybe, heavy set, and the two of them were standing close and talking low, and the van's engine was running, and nobody was saying goodbye. It read as two people having a work conversation. It read that way immediately, before I had any reason to think it. The van itself was nothing. White cargo van, the kind every plumber and parcel contractor in America drives. No lettering that I could see. Texas plates. I didn't get the number. Why would I? A woman I'd said no to had found a ride with somebody else, and none of it was my business. She never looked at me. I'm nearly sure of that. I was one more truck driver crossing one more lot, and she was turned mostly away, and I got in my cab and told myself the exact sentence I imagine you'd tell yourself. Small world on a big highway. There's one road out here. Everybody who left El Paso eastbound tonight is on it, and they're all stopping at the same 6 places. Of course I saw her again. That sentence is true, by the way. That's the poison in it. It's completely true. Interstate 10 funnels every soul in West Texas past the same handful of exits, and seeing the same car or the same person 2 or 3 times in a night is so common that drivers joke about it on the CB. The explanation was solid. I pulled out of Sierra Blanca, and I genuinely did not think about her again for 30 miles. I got to Van Horn a little after 10. Van Horn is the last real town for a long stretch, and every truck on Interstate 10 knows it, so the lots there stay busy deep into the night. The travel center I stopped at was slammed. Trucks doubled along the fence line, reefers droning, guys walking dogs in the fuel lights. I found a spot at the far edge of the lot, the dark end, backed against open desert, which at the time meant nothing to me except that it was the only hole left, and I was only stopping for a few minutes anyway. Here is exactly what I did in Van Horn, as close as I've been able to reconstruct it, and believe me, I have reconstructed it. I've walked through these few minutes hundreds of times. I set the brakes at 10:09. I know that from my ELD. I shut the engine off, took my keys, locked the driver's door with the fob, and walked to the building. That's about 150 yards, because of where I was parked. I used the restroom. I stood in line behind two other drivers and bought a large coffee and a pack of peppermints, the soft kind, which matters later. I paid cash. I walked back out. My receipt says 10:19. Call the whole thing 10 or 11 minutes. Most of it spent more than a football field away from my truck with my back to it, and a lot loud enough that you couldn't have heard a luggage door open and close, or slam, or anything else. When I got back, I did what I always do. Fob, handle, up the steps, quick look around the cab. Everything was where I'd left it. Doors had been locked. I'd felt the handle resist before the fob. My load was sealed and untouched. My tablet was on the dash, my cash envelope was in the door pocket, my jacket was on the passenger seat. Nothing stolen, nothing moved. I want to stop on that for 1 second. Nothing stolen. That's the whole checklist, isn't it? That's the entire security review a driver runs in his head at a truck stop. Did anybody take anything? Nobody had taken anything. It did not occur to me, standing in that lot in Van Horn, to run the other checklist. Did anybody leave anything? Did anybody add anything to this truck? There's no reason for that question to exist in your head. Trucks get robbed, trucks don't get donated to. I started the engine, let my air build, and pulled out of Van Horn at 10:26 in the evening, eastbound, with 118 miles of Interstate 10 between me and Fort Stockton, where I planned to shut down for the night. Say those two numbers to yourself. 10:26, 118 miles. The first thing I noticed was the passenger seat, and I noticed it almost immediately, within a mile or two of the on-ramp, and I explained it away in under 5 seconds. My passenger seat rides all the way back on its track. All the way. I keep my lunch cooler on the floor in front of it, and the seat has to be full rear for the cooler to fit, and that seat has not moved off full rear in years. Coming up through the gears out of Van Horn, I glanced over for my coffee, and the seat was wrong. Forward. Not a lot. 3-4 inches. Enough that the cooler was pinched at an angle against the seat base instead of sitting square. And my brain, without being asked, instantly said, the shop. I'd had the truck in for a service in El Paso 2 days before. Guys get in and out of your cab during a service. They slide seats to get at things. They never put anything back. That was my whole thought. Shop guys. I even felt a little flick of irritation at them. That specific mild annoyance you feel at somebody who moved your stuff. And then I let it go. What I did not do was think about whether that seat had been forward when I left El Paso that evening, whether it had been forward at Sierra Blanca. I couldn't tell you, because you don't look at things that are always the same. The seat had been invisible to me for years. I have no idea when it moved. I only know when I saw it. The second thing was the mint wrapper, and I found it maybe 20 miles out of Van Horn, in the dark, with my boot. I felt something crinkle under my heel on the floor by the pedals and reached down at it straight away and picked it up. Cellophane wrapper, twisted at both ends. The kind that comes off a soft peppermint. Now, I had just bought a pack of soft peppermints in Van Horn. They were sitting unopened in my cup holder. Unopened. I turned that little wrapper over in my fingers at 70 miles an hour, and my brain served up the explanation smooth and instant, same as it had been doing all night. You buy those mints all the time. That's an old wrapper. It slid out from under the seat when the shop guys moved it. It's your own trash from 3 weeks ago. I dropped it in my trash bag and drove on. And that explanation held right up until much later, when I had time to sit with the fact that I keep a clean floor, that I vacuum my cab every Sunday at the house, that I'd vacuumed it 4 days before, and that there was no 3-week-old wrapper riding around under my seat. Somebody had eaten a mint in my truck. Somebody nervous, waiting in the dark of a parking lot inside a stranger's cab, and had eaten a mint, and the wrapper had gotten away from her. The third thing was the curtain. Between my seats and my sleeper, there's a heavy blackout curtain on a track. I keep it tied halfway open when I drive. Always. half open, tied with a bungee, so I can reach back for my cooler bag or a sweatshirt without stopping. It is one of those arrangements that has been the same for so long that it isn't a choice anymore. It's just the shape of the truck. Somewhere around Michigan Flat, out in that long, dead flat dark west of the mountains, I reached back for my hoodie because the night was getting cold, and my hand hit fabric where there should have been open air. The curtain was closed, all the way, corner to corner, and the bungee that holds it half open was off its hook. I pulled my hand back and looked at it in the mirror light, the closed curtain, and I sat with it a second longer than I'd sat with the seat or the wrapper. This one was harder. Shop guys hadn't done that. I'd driven 2 days since the shop with that curtain tied open. And then Interstate 10 itself handed me the explanation, because right about then I crossed one of those stretches where the pavement goes bad, that broken concrete that hammers the whole cab, and I thought, there it is. Rough road. The bungee let go somewhere back there. Curtain slid shut on its track. It's a curtain on rollers. Things move. I want to be honest about my state of mind at this point, because I've heard people tell stories where the narrator claims he knew, deep down, the whole time. I didn't know. I promise you I didn't. What I had at around 11 o'clock at night, 40 miles east of Van Horn, was a low hum. 3 small wrong things inside an hour, each one explained, and underneath the explanations this hum, this faint tax on my attention, that kept my eyes going to the mirror on the curtain more than they needed to. If the hum had a voice, it wasn't saying someone is in the truck. Nobody's brain says that. It was saying something dumber and quieter. It was saying, "You're off tonight. Drink your coffee." So I drank my coffee. And I drove into the dark toward Balmorhea with the curtain closed behind my head. And behind that curtain, on my bunk, under my own blanket, a woman in a pink sweatshirt lay on her back with a stun gun on her chest, breathing through her mouth, listening to me sip. The exits for Balmorhea come up around 65 miles east of Van Horn. There's a state park down that way with a big spring-fed pool, and in the daytime, that stretch has a little traffic peeling off toward the mountains. At 11:40 at night, it has nothing. The interstate rides a long grade through open country. The median goes wide and black, and for minutes at a time the only lights in the world are your own headlights, the marker lights of a truck a mile ahead, and one set of headlights hanging back in your mirrors. I mention that last part now, but the truth is, I hadn't given those headlights a single thought yet. They were just a vehicle, back maybe a quarter mile, holding pace. Vehicles hold pace with trucks all night long. People set their crews off a big truck's taillights on lonely roads, because it's easier than watching the lane lines. I've had cars follow me for 200 miles that way, and I never once met the driver. So no, I hadn't clocked the headlights. Not yet. What I clocked, a few miles west of the Balmorhea exits, was a sound behind the curtain. It was fabric. That's the only way I can put it. A short, sliding, fabric-on-fabric sound, half a second long, from the bunk. The exact sound a duffel bag makes when it slumps over, or a jacket makes sliding off a pile, or a blanket makes when the road shakes it loose from where it's bunched. The exact sound. And also the exact sound a person's sleeve makes when they move an arm that's gone numb from holding still too long. I called out, reflex mostly. I said, "Settle down back there," the way you'd talk to a load, the way drivers mutter at their own trucks all day. And I said it because I assumed a box had come off the bunk shelf. I keep a plastic tote up there with paperwork and a printer in it, and my honest first thought was that the rough road had walked that tote to the edge, and it was about to come down and dump my registration all over the floor. Nothing answered, obviously. Nothing was going to answer either way. A tote doesn't talk, and neither does a person hiding behind a curtain. So the silence after I spoke proved nothing, confirmed nothing, and I settled back into the seat and put my eyes on the road and let the hum in the back of my head get a little louder, and several minutes went by. I've thought a lot about those several minutes, because of what they must have been on her side of the curtain. Me calling out had to have stopped her heart. She had to lie there, 3 feet from the back of my seat. wondering if settle down back there meant I knew, wondering if I was reaching for something, working out what she'd do if the curtain flew open at 70 miles an hour. She held still through all of that, held still for minutes. And when a person holds that still, holds their whole body rigid and clamps down on their own breathing, there comes a point where the body overrules them and demands air. That's what I heard next. That's the sound that ended the night's explanations. It was an exhale. One long, controlled exhale, pushed out slow through a small opening, the way you breathe out when you're trying to make no sound and your lungs are burning. It came from the bunk, from low on the bunk, and it lasted maybe 3 seconds. And there is no tote, no jacket, no blanket, no piece of cargo on this earth that makes that sound. Air came out of a person behind me. My body understood it before my mind finished the sentence. I felt my scalp move. I felt my hands change their grip on the wheel without me telling them to. There was a human being in my sleeper. I want to slow the story down here, because everything that mattered happened in the next 2 or 3 minutes, inside my skull, at 70 miles an hour. And from the outside, absolutely nothing happened at all. The truck never wavered in its lane. The cruise stayed set. If you'd been driving alongside me, you'd have seen a trucker sitting still, one hand on the wheel, staring down the road. That stillness was the hardest physical thing I have ever done. Because every instinct you have is wrong in that moment, and I knew it, and I had to talk myself out of each one in turn. Instinct 1, turn around and rip the curtain open. Confront it. And then what? I'm doing 70 with 44,000 pounds of coiled aluminum behind me on a dark 2-lane each-way interstate. The second I turn in that seat, I'm not driving this truck. If whoever is back there has a knife, a gun, a bar, anything, I've just put my face a foot from it and taken my hands off the wheel. If they have nothing at all and they panic and grab me, we're off the road. And an off the road at that speed with coils is not an accident. It's an ending. Coils don't forgive. The load alone made fighting in the cab unthinkable. Instinct 2, slam on the brakes, bail out, run. Same problem in a different order. An emergency stop from 70 takes the better part of a football field even done right. And done panicked, with somebody coming over the seat at you, it doesn't get done right. And say I manage it. Say I get stopped on the shoulder and get out. Now I'm standing on the darkest stretch of Interstate 10 in Texas, alone, at midnight, with my truck, my load, and whoever this is, and I've just shown them their game is up, and I don't know what they do when the game is up. And there was something else. Some early cold piece of my brain already asking a question I couldn't fully form yet. What if outside the truck is worse? What if outside the truck is exactly the point? Instinct 3, and this was the one that pulled at me hardest. Grab your phone and call 911. My phone was right there, mounted on the dash, big and bright, 4 feet from my hand, and angled the way I keep it, so I can see it from the driver's seat. Which means it can be seen from behind the driver's seat. The curtain hung 18 inches behind my shoulder. If there was a gap in that curtain, if she was watching, then the moment that screen lit up with a dial pad, she'd know I knew. My one advantage, the only card I held, was that she believed I didn't know. Everything in her behavior said she was waiting. She'd been aboard for over an hour and done nothing. She was waiting for something, some place, some moment, and as long as she thought I was ignorant, she'd keep waiting. The phone would spend that advantage all at once and get me nothing for it for at least 20 minutes. Because I knew where I was, and where I was nowhere. The nearest deputy could be 40 miles from that stretch of road at midnight. I'd be alone with her from the moment she knew until the moment help arrived. And I'd be alone with her at whatever speed and in whatever ditch that knowledge produced. My tire thumper, for what it's worth, was behind the passenger seat. Might as well have been in Ohio. So I did nothing. I drove. And while I drove, I made an inventory, same as a walk-around, except this one was of the situation. What did I actually know? Someone was in my sleeper, on or under my bunk, behind a closed curtain. They'd been there since Van Horn at the latest, which meant they'd passed up an hour of chances to rob me or hurt me while I sat there oblivious, which meant robbery now and hurt me now were not the plan. They were quiet, and they were staying quiet. That's a person waiting for a location, not a moment. And the seat, the wrapper, the curtain, the latch I had to slam, the loose panel under the bunk that I'd known about for years. All of it snapped together at once, unforced, into one picture. The luggage door, the panel, the bunk. In through the box, push the panel, up under the blanket. 10 minutes in a dark corner of a busy lot while I stood in line buying peppermints. My skin went cold in a new way when I got to the last piece, because the last piece was a pink sweatshirt in El Paso, asking me personally, by name of my truck, if not my body, for a ride east. She hadn't been working the lot. She'd been shopping it. And when I said no, I hadn't ended anything. I'd been selected anyway. Which meant the white van at Sierra Blanca was not a coincidence and never had been. And that thought sent my eyes, finally properly, to my mirrors, to the headlights that had been hanging a quarter-mile back for I honestly did not know how long, sitting there, holding pace. 2 low headlights with a wide-set spacing, van-shaped if you wanted them to be van-shaped, and I very much did not want them to be. I needed to do 2 things, and I needed to do both without moving anything above my elbows in a way that would look wrong from behind. I needed to get word out, and I needed to test the headlights. The word out came first, and it came from the one screen in my cab that faces away from the sleeper. My ELD, the electronic log tablet, sits low on the dash to the right of the wheel, angled up at my face, its back to the curtain. It logs my hours, and it messages my dispatch service. I run my authority through a small dispatch outfit, and there's a woman on their night desk. And that little message window had never in my life mattered until it was the only private square of light in my world. I've typed on that screen 10,000 times. Fuel receipts, load numbers, detention times. Drivers peck at their ELDs constantly. It's the most natural gesture in a cab. And I made myself do it exactly that way, casual, one finger, glancing down and back up to the road, down and back up, while my heart worked at twice its normal speed. It took me most of a mile to type it. I remember deciding the words needed to be short and could not be misread by a tired dispatcher as anything routine. Person hiding in my sleeper right now, not a joke. Contact police. Interstate 10 east near Balmorhea. Mile marker 209. Do not call my phone. Do not call the cab. Will signal by message only. I hit send, and I put my finger back on the wheel, and I looked at the dark road, and for the length of about 3 breaths, nothing in the universe happened. Then the little envelope icon blinked, and the reply came up in the corner of the screen, and I have never loved a human being I've never met the way I loved that night dispatcher. Received, calling now. Stay in motion. Message me every 10 minutes or I escalate. You are not alone. Now the test. My CB hangs from the header above the windshield, and the mic cord swings by my right shoulder. I don't talk on it much anymore. Hardly anybody does. But the radio was on low the way it always is. Channel 19 hissing along under the engine. And a CB has one property that made it perfect for what I needed. Everyone can hear it. The woman behind my curtain could hear every word I said into that mic. And if the van behind me had a radio on 19, and working vans that shadow trucks tend to, then the van could hear me too. I had a channel that broadcast straight into the ears of both people hunting me, and they both believed I didn't know they existed. You can do a lot with a thing that everyone trusts. I keyed up and put on the voice. Bored, half mumbled, the voice of a man talking to the night because the night is long. I called out to anybody eastbound, got a driver somewhere ahead of me who came back, and we did the usual nothing. Smoky reports, road work at Fort Stockton, how dead the radio's gotten. My voice held. I listened to it hold from somewhere outside my own body. And then I laid the bait in, lazy, right in the middle of the nothing. I said my eyes were getting heavy, and I wasn't going to fight it. There was a rest area coming up in a few miles, and I was going to bag it there for the night, catch the parking while it was there. The other driver said take it easy. I said the same. I let the mic hang back on its clip. There is a rest area on that stretch, east of the Balmorhea exits. I knew it well. And here is what I knew about it that made it the perfect bait. At midnight on a Tuesday, it is a nearly empty concrete island in an ocean of black desert. A handful of trucks, no attendant, no lights past the pavilions. If I were two people planning to take a truck and its driver somewhere quiet, I could not design a better place. A rest area announcement was an invitation, and only guilty ears would RSVP. I watched the mirror. For about half a minute, nothing. The headlights hung where they'd hung for an hour, a quarter-mile back, steady, long enough that I started building the relief in my chest, started drafting the thought that maybe the van was just a van. Then the left headlights swung out. The pair of them slid into the passing lane and began to grow. No hurry to it, no drama. A vehicle changing lanes and picking up speed, and 100 vehicles had done that all night. Except this one grew until it was 200 yards back, then 100. And as it came up level with my trailer, I looked down through my window, and there it was. White cargo van, Texas plates. A shape at the wheel, heavy set, and I did not turn my head. I watched it in the glass, and with the edge of my eye, and the van ran alongside my drives for 3 or 4 seconds, right in the blind spot a professional would choose, and then pulled ahead and eased right, and its blinker came on for the rest area exit, 1 mile ahead. It went down the ramp. I watched its taillights sink into the dark of the rest area, positioning itself where it could watch the entrance, waiting for a Kenworth that had just told the whole radio it was coming to bed. I drove past that exit at 67 miles an hour, and I did not so much as lift my foot, and passing it felt enormous. The rest area lights slid by on my right and were gone, and somewhere behind my curtain a woman lay in the dark, doing the same thing I was doing, waiting to find out what I'd do next. As far as she knew, I'd simply changed my mind, which tired drivers do all the time. As far as I knew, I'd just confirmed that there were 2 of them, that they were coordinated, and that the plan had a shape now. She rides. I stop somewhere dark. The van closes in. And a truck full of aluminum and a driver full of blood go wherever trucks and drivers go when the industry news says the driver abandoned his vehicle. I messaged dispatch. Van took the bait at the rest area at mile marker 214. White cargo van, Texas plates. 2 of them working together. I am not stopping. Fort Stockton Police or Pecos County Sheriff, I will bring it to them. The reply came back inside a minute. Sheriff notified. They are coordinating. Continue to Fort Stockton. Do not stop for anything. They will be ready. And then there was nothing left to do but the hour. I want to try to give you that hour, and I know before I start that I'm going to fail because nothing happened during it, and it was the longest span of time I have ever lived. 50-some miles of Interstate 10. The van reappeared in my mirrors within 10 minutes, hanging back at its quarter mile, and I understood that it would just keep doing that, patient, all night if it had to, because from their side, nothing had gone wrong yet. From their side, a tired driver had gotten a second wind. Fine. He'd stop eventually. Everybody stops eventually. Behind me the curtain stayed shut, and I drove with a passenger I could not see and could not forget for 1 second. Do you know what your own sleeper sounds like when you're listening to it? I do now. I know every tick my bunk frame makes over an expansion joint. I know the sound my blanket makes against the wall. Twice in that hour I heard her move, small settling sounds, weight shifting on the mattress, and both times every hair on my arm stood up and I had to run my eyes across my gauges one by one. Oil, pyro, air, fuel, naming them in my head, just to have somewhere to put my mind. Once, and only once, the curtain opened. It was maybe 40 minutes into the hour. I caught it in the edge of the mirror light, the left seam of the curtain easing back from the wall. Less than an inch. A dark gap, and in the gap, low down, part of a hand. Fingers curled around the curtain's edge, and above the fingers a strip of cuff, pink. She held it there for a while. I will never know how long, because time had stopped meaning anything, but call it a minute. She was looking at me, at the back of my head, at the mirrors, at my phone glowing on its mount with its map running and nothing else, at a driver slouched and steady with one wrist hung over the wheel, checking her work. I gave her a man with no idea. I let my head nod a little with the road. I reached over slow and turned the CB volume one notch without a flicker in my face, and some while later, when I looked again, the seam was closed and the hand was gone. A few minutes after that, my spare phone lit up inside the sleeper. I keep an old phone back there on a shelf by the bunk, plugged in as a backup. I'd forgotten it existed. What I saw was its glow, a soft square of light soaking through the curtain fabric low on the left side, on for half a minute, off, then on again a few minutes later. She'd found it. And she wasn't calling anybody, no voice ever came, so she was typing to the van, updating them. He's still driving, he's talking on the radio, he doesn't know anything. And the glow through the curtain, the light of my own phone being used to manage my own hunting, made me angrier than anything else in the whole night, some cold, clean strip of anger that I was honestly glad to have, because it burned off the last of the shake in my hands. I used the CB one more time in that hour. I keyed up to nobody in particular and grumbled about my pyrometer running hot. Said I might have an exhaust leak. Said out loud to the empty channel that I'd have to get it looked at in Fort Stockton in the morning, and I guessed I'd limp it in and park at the truck stop there. Half of that was for her, so the destination made sense. Half was for the van, same reason. A truck stop in Fort Stockton was a fine place for their plan. Busy enough to enter, dark enough at the edges. Let them both spend the last 50 miles believing the night still belonged to them. Dispatch messaged at every interval, and I answered at every interval. And somewhere in the last 20 miles the messages changed tone. Deputies staged. When you reach town, proceed to the sheriff's complex on Highway 285. Do not slow before, they know your truck. Lay on your horn when you arrive and get out and walk. Do not look back at the cab. The lights of Fort Stockton came up out of the desert a few minutes after 1:30 in the morning. That low orange smear that towns make on the night sky out there. And I let the cruise off and came down through the gears on the long approach. And that's when she spoke to me. It was the first human voice from behind that curtain in 118 miles, and it was calm and unhurried and pitched the way you'd talk to a friend in the front seat. She said, "You missed your exit." The truck stop exit was sliding past on my right. She'd been following the signs through the gap in the curtain, or on my spare phone's map. She knew the plan I'd fed the radio, and I'd just driven past it, and she wanted to know why. And she decided the fastest way to find out was to stop being a stowaway and become a passenger. Easy as that, 3 feet behind my ear. I have been asked many times what I said back. I said nothing, not one word. I put my blinker on for the next exit, the business route into town, and took the ramp at a legal and reasonable speed. And in my mirrors the white van came down the ramp after me with no quarter-mile left in it at all. Close now. Closing. Because a truck off its script had made them decide too, and everything everywhere was out of patience at the same time. The sheriff's complex sits off the highway on the south side, and I knew the building. I'd driven past it 100 times in 11 years and never once thought about it. And now it was the only place on the surface of the earth. She said something else behind me as I made the last turn, sharper this time, My name off my own permit book maybe, or just hey, 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 and I heard her weight come off the bunk, and I did not answer, and I did not turn around. I swung the truck into the complex lot wide and hard, right at the front of the building, right up over the painted lines, and I put my palm on the air horn, and I held it down. Held it. Set the parking brakes with the horn still roaring. Both valves bang and bang, grabbed my keys, opened my door, and went down the steps in one motion, and I walked away from my own truck across that parking lot, on legs I couldn't feel, toward the glass doors, and the figures already coming out of them. And I did exactly what dispatch said. I did not look back. What I know from after, deputies came around both sides of that Kenworth within seconds. Weapons out, lights up, and they took her out of my sleeper without anyone getting hurt. She'd been headed over the seats when the horn went off and the world filled with cops, and she'd gone back and down instead, under the bunk, into the space behind the loose panel, and that's where they found her, along with her backpack. In the backpack were plastic restraints, a roll of tape, a stun gun, and my spare phone, still logged into a message thread with one other number. The van never even made it to me. A second set of deputies had it stopped at a fuel station on the edge of town within minutes, and the heavy-set man from Sierra Blanca was in cuffs before I'd finished saying my own name to the officer taking my statement. Over the weeks after, investigators tied the two of them to a string of jobs across 3 states. Trucks that vanished with their loads. Drivers who, the reports all said, had apparently walked away from their rigs and their careers and their lives at remote stops, abandoned their vehicles, and never turned up. 4 of those drivers have never turned up. I got my truck back after 2 days of processing. First thing I did was drive it to a shop and pay full price, no complaints, to have the luggage latch replaced, and that panel behind the bunk screwed down with steel fasteners, and I stood there and watched them do it. I still run Interstate 10. I ran it last month, but there's a stretch now, between Van Horn and Fort Stockton, where the radio stays off, and my eyes do a circuit they never used to do. Mirrors. Curtain. Mirrors. And I let myself remember it because I think I owe it that. 118 miles of desert. A man drinking his coffee, mumbling on his radio, nodding along with the road, keeping his voice flat and his hands still, while his heart tried to break out of him. She had been 6 feet behind me for 118 miles. I have been driving tractor trailers for a little over 12 years, and I am one of those drivers who does the same walk around every single time I stop. I do not care if I have been parked for 10 hours or 10 minutes. Before I move the truck, I get out and look at it. I check the steer tires. I look beneath the engine for fresh leaks. I make sure nobody has pulled my 5th wheel release. I look at the airlines, the drive tires, the trailer tandems, the doors, and the seal. If it is dark, I do it with a flashlight. If it is raining, I do it in the rain. Other drivers have given me a hard time over it. I have been told I act like a driving school instructor. I have had guys laugh at me for checking a truck that had not moved since the night before. I never took it personally. Most of the drivers saying that had probably done the same thing when they were new. After enough years on the road, though, people start cutting corners. I understand why. You get tired. It is cold outside. Your appointment is already tight, and the truck beside you is parked so close that you can barely squeeze between the mirrors. Sometimes you just want to release the brakes and get moving. I am not going to pretend I never cut corners anywhere else. I have eaten things from truck stop hot cases that should probably have required a medical waiver. I have driven longer than I wanted because the next safe place to park was farther away than I expected. I have postponed showers, slept in dirty clothes, and convinced myself that a strange engine noise could wait until morning. The walk around is the one thing I have always done. The reason goes back to something an instructor told me when I was getting my commercial license. He said a tractor trailer was too large for the driver to know what was around it without getting out and looking. That sounds obvious, but it stuck with me. From the driver's seat you can see a lot. You have mirrors covering both sides. You sit high enough to look over most traffic. You have lights, cameras, alarms, and sensors. But there are places around a truck that are completely invisible from the cab. I found that out in Amarillo. This happened several winters ago. I was working for a medium-sized refrigerated carrier based in Arkansas, although I was pulling a dry van that week because the company had more dry freight than refrigerated loads. I had picked up mixed grocery freight from a warehouse on the west side of Albuquerque. It was going to a distribution center in Oklahoma City. The trailer was loaded fairly heavy, a little under 40,000 pounds, and the appointment was late the following morning. It should have been an easy run. I left Albuquerque in the afternoon, went east through the mountains, and crossed into Texas after dark. A cold front had moved through earlier that day. The roads were dry, but the temperature was dropping quickly, and the wind was strong enough to push at the side of the trailer. Anyone who has driven through the Texas Panhandle knows what that wind can be like. There is not much out there to slow it down. It comes across the open ground and catches the trailer like a sail. By the time I reached Amarillo, I had been correcting against it for hours. I was not falling asleep, but I was worn out in that way drivers understand. My shoulders hurt from holding the wheel. My eyes felt dry. I was hungry, and I had begun paying more attention to the clock on my electronic log than I was comfortable with. I had enough driving time left to continue beyond the city, but not enough to guarantee that I would find legal parking farther east. Every experienced driver has made that calculation. You can take the safe space you see now, or you can gamble on another one 50 miles down the road. I decided not to gamble. The first major truck stop I checked was full. Drivers were already parked along the entrance ramp and around the edges of the fuel island. The second place was not much better. I made one slow loop through the lot and saw 3 trucks waiting for one driver who appeared to be getting ready to leave. I kept going. On the east side of Amarillo, not far from the airport, I pulled into an older independent truck plaza on the frontage road beside Interstate 40. I am not going to name the place. What happened was not the truck stop's fault, and as far as I know it has changed ownership since then anyway. The main lot was paved and fairly well lit. The overflow area behind it was another story. It was a broad section of cracked asphalt and packed dirt running behind the service building. A low-budget motel sat beyond a chain-link fence on one side. On the other side was an open field with dead winter grass and scattered trash caught along the fence. The overflow area had several light poles, but only about half of them worked. There were already close to 20 trucks back there. Some were lined up correctly. Others had made their own spaces wherever they could fit. A few bobtail tractors were parked along the motel fence, and there were several passenger vehicles mixed in with them. I found a pull-through space near the back. That mattered later. Instead of backing toward the fence, I was able to pull through between 2 rows and stop with my tractor facing east. When I left in the morning, I would only need to release the brakes and drive forward. There was a flatbed on my driver's side and an empty space on my passenger side. Beyond that space was a narrow lane leading toward the motel parking lot. I set the brakes, shut down the engine, and sat there for a minute listening to the wind push against the cab. It was a little after 1 in the morning. My company required a post-trip inspection at the end of the shift. Some drivers completed it from the seat and checked every box without looking at anything. I got out. The temperature was somewhere in the upper 20s, but the wind made it feel much colder. It cut through my sweatshirt before I had taken 3 steps. I walked around the front of the tractor and checked the passenger side steer tire. I looked beneath the engine with my flashlight. I checked the drive tires, the air lines, the 5th wheel, and the trailer. There was nobody beneath the truck. I want to make that clear. There was nothing beside the drive tires. There was nothing lying between the tractor and the trailer. I shined my flashlight directly through that area while looking at the airlines. I checked the trailer seal, entered the number into the company application, and took the required photograph. When I came back along the driver's side, a man was standing near my cab. I had not heard him approach because of the wind and the idling trucks around us. He looked to be in his mid-30s, although it was hard to tell in the poor lighting. He was thin and wore jeans, work boots, and a tan canvas jacket over a gray sweatshirt. He had no hat despite the cold. His hair was very short, and there was a dark mark near one side of his mouth. At first I thought it was a shadow. When he stepped closer to the light, I realized his lip was split. He asked if I was heading east. I said I was. He wanted to know how far. That is a question drivers hear all the time. Sometimes it is another driver asking about road conditions. Sometimes it is someone looking for a ride. Every company I have worked for has had strict rules against unauthorized passengers, and I would not have let a stranger into my truck regardless. I told him I was going to Oklahoma City, but could not take anyone with me. He said his brother had left him at the motel after an argument. According to him, his wallet and phone were both in his brother's pickup. He only needed to get as far as Oklahoma City, where he had family. I told him again that I could not help. He offered me $200. That was when I became uncomfortable. People who honestly need a ride usually do not lead with that much cash after claiming they have lost their wallet. I also noticed that he kept looking past me toward the motel. I followed his eyes. A dark pickup was parked near the far end of the motel building. Its headlights were off, but the engine appeared to be running. I could see exhaust moving through the cold air. The man said the money was in his jacket. He reached toward one of the pockets, but I stepped back and told him not to. I was not accusing him of having a weapon. I simply did not want him reaching into his clothing while standing that close to me in a dark parking lot. He stopped. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then he asked when I planned to leave. I should not have answered. I know that now. At the time, I assumed he was deciding whether it was worth waiting around in case I changed my mind. I told him I would be leaving after my break, sometime around sunrise. The man looked toward the motel again. The pickup had begun moving. It rolled slowly through the motel lot without turning on its headlights. When it reached the opening in the fence, it turned into the truck overflow area. The man immediately walked away from me. He did not run. He just lowered his head and moved between two parked trailers toward the service building. The pickup continued in the same direction. It was an older, dark-colored crew cab truck. I could not see the license plate from where I stood. There appeared to be two people inside, but the windows were tinted. It passed behind my trailer and followed the lane the man had taken. I waited beside my tractor for another minute, expecting to hear an argument or see someone chasing him. Nothing happened. The pickup disappeared between the parked trucks. I considered going inside and telling the clerk, but I did not know what I would have reported. A man had asked me for a ride. A pickup had driven through a parking lot. That was it. I climbed into my cab, locked both doors, and pulled the curtains closed. The whole interaction had bothered me, but not enough to make me leave. That is another question people have asked since then. Why did I stay? The answer is that strange encounters happen at truck stops. Drivers see people arguing, asking for money, selling things, looking for rides, and wandering around at all hours. If I abandoned every parking space because someone made me uncomfortable, I would never complete a break. I also had very little time left on my driving clock. Moving to another truck stop could have put me in violation, and there was no guarantee another space would be available. So I stayed. I went into the service building to use the restroom and buy food. The place was old but clean enough. There was one clerk behind the counter and a maintenance employee mopping near the coffee station. I looked for the man in the tan jacket. He was not inside. I bought a microwaved sandwich, a bottle of water, and a cup of coffee I did not need. On my way back to the truck, I noticed the dark pickup parked beside the motel again. This time the engine was off. I could not see anyone inside. Back in the cab, I ate while checking messages from dispatch. My delivery appointment had not changed. The weather east of Amarillo looked clear. I sent my wife a message saying I had stopped for the night and would call after the delivery. Then I set my alarm and moved into the sleeper. I run an auxiliary power unit at night rather than idling the main engine. It cycles on and off depending on the temperature and battery level. When it shuts down, the cab can become surprisingly quiet. I remember lying there and hearing the wind rattle something against the trailer beside me. At some point I fell asleep. I do not know exactly when I woke up the first time. The clock on the sleeper wall said a little after 3, but I cannot say whether I had been awake for a few seconds or several minutes before looking at it. Something had bumped the truck. It was not a hard impact. The cab rocked once on its suspension, followed by a faint scraping sound beneath the sleeper. I stayed still and listened. Nothing followed. My first thought was that the flatbed driver beside me had opened a storage box and struck my tractor. My second thought was that someone was trying to steal fuel. Fuel theft was not as common there as it was in some places, but it happened. The caps on that truck did not lock, and a person with a hose and a few containers could take quite a bit before a sleeping driver noticed. I got out of the bunk and looked through a narrow gap in the curtain. The driver's side mirror showed the flatbed beside me. Its lights were off. There was no movement around it. I checked the passenger side. The empty parking space was still empty. Beyond it, the motel lot was mostly dark. I could see the pickup though. It was parked near the end of the motel building with its front pointed toward the truck lot. I watched for a while. Nobody moved around it. I thought about getting dressed and checking outside, but the temperature had dropped and the cab was still moving slightly in the wind. I decided the wind had shifted something beneath the trailer or pushed a piece of debris against the truck. I returned to the bunk. Several minutes later, the auxiliary power unit shut down. That was when I heard voices. They were low and close, somewhere behind the cab. I could not make out most of what was being said because of the wind and the insulation in the sleeper. Then one voice became clear. It said, "Get his arm in." There are certain sentences your brain tries to correct after you hear them. I told myself the man had said something about an alarm. Maybe the flatbed driver was helping another driver repair something. Maybe there were mechanics working between the trucks. I listened again. I heard a dragging sound followed by a soft metallic knock beneath the floor. The truck moved on its suspension. I sat up and reached for my phone. There was no reason for anyone to be beneath my tractor at 3 in the morning. I considered calling 911, but I still did not know what was happening. I did not want to tell an emergency dispatcher that I had heard a noise under my truck and imagined a sentence through the wall. Instead, I turned on the exterior work lights. Those lights illuminated the back of the tractor and the area around the fifth wheel. From inside the cab, I watched the mirrors. For 1 second, I saw a shadow move across the passenger side light. Then it was gone. A vehicle door closed somewhere near the motel. The dark pickup's parking lights came on. It pulled away from the motel, crossed the overflow lot, and exited toward the frontage road. I never saw who got into it. The lot became quiet again. I waited with the lights on for close to 15 minutes. No one approached the truck. No one appeared in the mirrors. Eventually I convinced myself that whoever had been outside was gone. I did not go back to sleep properly after that. I lay in the bunk with my phone beside me and listened to every noise. The wind pushed at the trailer. Air tanks discharged. Refrigeration units started and stopped. Drivers pulled out of spaces, their headlights moving through the curtains. Each sound seemed connected to the one beneath my cab. By around 5, the truck lot had begun waking up. Engines started in different rows. Drivers walked toward the service building carrying shower bags and coffee cups. The ordinary activity made me feel foolish. Whatever I had heard during the night seemed less threatening once other people were outside. My alarm went off shortly before 5:30. I got dressed, moved into the driver's seat, and checked the electronic log. I had completed my break. If I left within the next half hour, I would reach the receiver with enough time to fuel and still arrive early. I started the engine and let the air pressure build. This detail is important. I started the engine, but I did not release either brake. The yellow and red knobs remained pulled out. The tractor and trailer were still locked in place. While the engine warmed, I entered my route into the navigation system and completed the first part of the company's electronic inspection form. I remember being annoyed about having to get out. The cab was warm. Outside, the temperature was below freezing. The wind had not eased. I had already inspected the truck before going to sleep, and it had not moved. For maybe half a second, I considered checking the boxes from the seat. I had never done that before, but I considered it. Then I thought about the noise beneath the sleeper. I put on my coat, grabbed my flashlight, and climbed down. The sky was beginning to lighten, but the overflow lot was still mostly dark. A thin gray line sat along the eastern horizon. The light poles made the blowing dust and bits of trash look like they were moving through fog. I started at the front of the tractor. The hood was still latched. There were no fresh leaks beneath the engine. Both steer tires looked normal. I moved along the driver's side. The fuel cap was secure. Nothing appeared damaged around the steps or battery box. The flatbed beside me was still parked. Its curtains were closed, although the engine was idling. I walked between the back of my cab and the trailer, checking the airlines and fifth wheel. Everything was connected. When I reached the passenger side, my flashlight passed over something near the drive tires. At first, I thought it was an old work boot. Truck stop lots collect all kinds of trash. I have seen shoes, clothes, broken appliances, bottles, mattresses, and pieces of furniture abandoned beside parked trucks. The boot was lying on its side beneath the fuel tank. I moved the light farther inward. There was a leg attached to it. For a moment, I could not understand what I was seeing. A man was lying crosswise beneath the tractor. His legs extended under the frame toward the driver's side. His upper body was on the passenger side, directly in front of the first set of drive tires. One shoulder was pushed partly beneath the outer tire. The side of his head was less than a foot from the rubber. If the truck moved forward, the drive tires would pass over his upper body. The man was wearing jeans and a tan canvas jacket. It was the person who had asked me for a ride. His hands were secured behind his back with black plastic ties. Gray tape covered his mouth and wrapped around the back of his head. There was dried blood along one side of his face, much more than I had seen earlier. His eyes were closed. I stumbled backward and nearly dropped the flashlight. My first assumption was that he was dead. Then I saw his jacket move. It was a very small movement, but it matched the rhythm of breathing. I looked toward the motel. The dark pickup was gone. I looked around the truck lot. Several drivers were walking near the service building, but nobody was close enough to see what I had found. I crouched a few feet away from the man. I did not touch him. I was afraid his neck or back might be broken, and I did not know whether moving him would make things worse. I said that I was going to call for help. His eyelids moved, but he did not open them. I stood and dialed 911. The dispatcher asked for the address. I gave the name of the truck plaza and described the overflow lot. I explained that an injured man had been placed beneath my tractor and that the truck had not moved since the previous night. She asked whether the person was breathing. I said he was. She told me not to move him and not to move the truck. I remember looking through the gap between the drive tires and thinking there was no possibility of me moving it. The dispatcher asked whether anyone else was nearby. Before I could answer, I saw the dark pickup enter the motel driveway. It came from the frontage road with its headlights off. I told the dispatcher that the vehicle I had seen during the night had returned. She instructed me to get inside my cab, lock the doors, and remain on the phone. I climbed up the passenger side steps because they were closest. The moment I shut the door, I locked both sides. The pickup crossed through the opening in the fence and entered the overflow lot. It was moving faster than before. I shifted into the driver's seat and watched through the mirrors. The pickup drove behind my trailer and stopped at an angle, partly blocking the lane. Both front doors opened. 2 men got out. Neither of them was the man beneath the truck. The driver was broad and heavy-set, wearing a dark coat and a baseball cap. The passenger was thinner, with a hood pulled over his head. The heavy-set man walked toward my door. The thinner one went directly to the passenger side drive tires. That removed any doubt that they knew the injured man was there. I told the dispatcher what they were doing. She said officers were on the way and repeated that I should not leave the cab. The heavy-set man reached my door and pulled the handle. When it did not open, he struck the glass with the side of his hand. He pointed toward the ground beneath the tractor and shouted that there was someone under my truck. I already knew that. Then he pointed forward. He wanted me to move. At first, he acted as though he were trying to help. He made a rolling motion with both hands and pointed toward the front of the truck again. The thin man had crouched beside the drive tires. He reached beneath the tractor, grabbed the injured man by the back of his jacket, and pulled. The man's head moved closer to the tire. I leaned on the air horn. The sound filled the lot. The heavy-set man jumped away from the door. The thin man released the jacket and covered his ears. I held the horn for several seconds, stopped, and then sounded it again. Curtains opened in nearby trucks. Headlights came on. The driver in the flatbed beside me leaned toward his window. The heavy-set man began striking my door again. This time he was not pretending to help. He shouted that I had run over someone and needed to get out. The dispatcher could hear him through my phone. I told her the truck had not moved. The brakes were still set, and my electronic log showed I had been stationary all night. She told me not to argue with him and said officers were close. The thin man reached under the tractor again. He pulled the injured man farther toward the tire. I sounded the horn until the air pressure began dropping. The heavy-set man moved away from my door and took out his phone. A few seconds later, the thin man stood and walked quickly toward the service building. I assumed he was leaving. He was not. He had called the truck stop. The overnight maintenance employee came out through a rear door carrying a flashlight. The thin man met him halfway and began pointing toward my tractor. The employee followed him. From inside the cab, I could not hear their conversation. I could see the thin man making frantic gestures. He pointed at the drive tires, then at me, then forward along the lane. The maintenance employee approached the passenger side and shined his flashlight beneath the truck. He saw the injured man. He immediately stepped back. The thin man moved beside him and made the same rolling gesture the heavy-set man had made. They wanted the employee to signal me forward. For a second, it appeared to work. The employee came around the front of the tractor and stood where I could see him through the windshield. He raised one arm and motioned for me to move ahead slowly. I shook my head. He signaled again. The 2 suspects had apparently told him that the man was trapped, and the truck needed to move before anyone could pull him out. I pointed down toward my brake knobs and yelled through the closed window that the man was alive and directly in front of the tires. The employee could not hear me over the engine. The heavy-set man stepped into view and began signaling too. I grabbed my Citizens Band radio microphone. Most drivers leave the radio on channel 19, although plenty keep the volume low at night. I said that any driver in the East Overflow area needed to call 911. I told them 2 men were trying to make me move my tractor with an injured person beneath the drive tires. My voice sounded much calmer over the radio than I felt. The flatbed driver beside me answered almost immediately. He asked which truck. I described mine and said I was directly beside him. His curtain opened fully. A few seconds later, the flatbed's horn sounded. Then another truck horn answered from across the lot. The maintenance employee stopped signaling. He looked beneath the tractor again, this time from farther away. I saw his flashlight settle on the injured man's hands. The black ties were clearly visible. The employee backed away from the thin man. The thin man reached for his arm, The employee pulled free and began walking quickly toward the service building. That was when both suspects dropped the act. The thin man ran toward my passenger door and climbed onto the step. He pulled the handle, then struck the window with a small metal object. The first impact made a sharp cracking sound. The glass did not break, but it left a mark near the bottom corner. I moved away from the passenger side and pressed myself against the driver's door. The thin man struck the window again. The heavy-set man circled around the front of the tractor. The dispatcher told me officers were entering the property. I could not see them yet. The flatbed driver opened his door. He was an older man with a white beard. He remained on the upper step of his cab and held his phone in front of him, recording. He did not approach the suspects, which was the smart thing to do. He simply shouted that police were coming and that both men were on camera. The thin man stepped down from my truck. The heavy-set man looked toward the frontage road. Blue lights had appeared near the fuel entrance. Both suspects ran for the pickup. The heavy-set man reached the driver's side first. The thin man climbed into the passenger seat while the truck was already beginning to move. They reversed down the lane behind my trailer. A tanker had pulled forward from one of the rows and stopped across part of the exit. I do not know whether the driver had heard my radio call or simply saw the commotion, but his trailer blocked the most direct path to the frontage road. The pickup swerved around him and cut between two parked tractors. One of its mirrors struck the side of a trailer and broke away. The pickup continued toward the motel. A marked patrol vehicle entered through the opening in the fence at the same time. The pickup driver tried to turn around the patrol vehicle. He climbed a curb, crossed a strip of dead grass, and hit the motel's chain-link fence. The fence bent but did not collapse. The pickup became wedged between the fence and a concrete drainage barrier. Both doors opened. The thin man ran behind the motel. The heavy-set driver made it only a few steps before an officer stopped him beside the fence. Two more patrol vehicles entered the lot. One continued around the motel after the passenger. I stayed inside the cab. Even after I saw the heavy-set man on the ground with his hands behind his back, I did not unlock the doors. The dispatcher told me to remain where I was until an officer came to me. That took less than a minute. It felt much longer. An officer approached from the front with one hand raised where I could see it. I lowered the window a few inches and confirmed that I had called. He asked whether the brakes were set. I said both the tractor and trailer brakes were engaged and had been the entire time. He told me not to touch anything. Emergency medical personnel arrived shortly after. They crawled beneath the tractor from the passenger side. One of them cut the plastic ties around the man's wrists, while another stabilized his head. They removed the tape from his mouth and placed an oxygen mask over his face. I could not hear what the injured man said. I saw his eyes open once. It took several people to slide him onto a board and move him away from the tires. They carried him to the ambulance and left almost immediately. By then, officers had found the second suspect behind the motel. He had tried to hide inside an outdoor utility enclosure. A maintenance worker saw him climbing the fence and pointed officers in the right direction. Both men were taken away. I assumed I would be allowed to leave after giving a statement. Instead, the entire area around my tractor became a crime scene. An officer photographed the ground, the drive tires, the passenger door, and the small mark where the suspect had struck the window. Another officer crawled beneath the tractor and collected pieces of gray tape and one cut plastic tie. They asked me to shut down the engine, but leave the brakes set. I remained in the cab for close to an hour while they worked. Eventually, a detective arrived and asked me to explain everything from the moment I entered the lot. I told him about the man asking for a ride. I described the dark pickup, the split lip, the offer of $200, and the question about when I would leave. I told him about waking to the truck moving on its suspension. I repeated the sentence I had heard beneath the sleeper, "Get his arm in." The detective wrote it down. He asked whether I had performed an inspection after parking. I said I had. That turned out to be important. My company's application recorded the exact time I completed the post-trip inspection. It also stored the photograph I had taken of the trailer seal. The picture did not show the area beneath the tractor, but the timestamp supported what I had said. The electronic log showed that the truck had remained stationary from shortly after 1 in the morning until police arrived. The engine control system also recorded that the transmission had never been placed into gear after I parked. There was no mechanical possibility that I had driven over the man and forgotten about it. The detective asked whether my truck had exterior cameras. It had a forward-facing camera mounted near the windshield, but no cameras aimed at the sides or rear. The forward camera showed me entering the overflow lot and pulling into the space. It also showed that nobody had been lying in front of the tractor when I arrived. It did not show what happened behind the cab during the night. The truck plaza had security cameras covering the fuel island, store entrances, and main parking area. The overflow lot was only partly visible. The motel had several cameras. Most of those worked. Police reviewed the recordings while I waited. A little before 8 in the morning, the detective returned and asked me to watch part of the video. It was recorded from a camera mounted above the motel office. The image was grainy and had no sound, but it showed the opening in the fence and much of the truck overflow area. At a little after 3 in the morning, the dark pickup left a parking space beside the motel. It stopped behind my trailer with its lights off. The 2 suspects got out. They opened the rear door and pulled the man in the tan jacket from the back seat. His hands were already tied. They dragged him across the asphalt using his jacket and the back of his belt. He appeared unconscious. His boots struck the ground as they moved him between the trailers. That was the scraping sound I had heard. The video did not clearly show them placing him beneath my tractor because another trailer blocked the camera's view. It showed both men disappear beside my truck. Several minutes later, my exterior work lights came on. The suspects immediately returned to the pickup and left. The bump that woke me had almost certainly been the injured man's body striking the fuel tank or one of the suspension components. The detective said turning on the lights might have saved the man's life. The suspects had not finished positioning him when they left. One of his arms was still extended outward. That was apparently what they had been discussing when I heard them. Had I remained asleep, they might have pushed him farther beneath the truck. Had I gotten out, I might have encountered both of them in the dark. I asked why they had returned at sunrise. The detective did not know yet. He said they may have been watching from somewhere nearby. They could have expected me to leave earlier. When I started the engine but did not move, they might have assumed something had gone wrong. The pickup had also left the motel property for more than an hour. Police believed the suspects had used that time to dispose of the injured man's belongings. They found his phone later that morning in a drainage ditch beside the frontage road. The truck remained in place until close to noon. My company sent another driver to take the trailer and complete the delivery. A mobile mechanic disconnected the tractor from it after officers finished photographing the fifth wheel area. I was taken to the police station to give a formal statement. By that point, I had been awake most of the night. I remember sitting beneath fluorescent lights with a paper cup of coffee, repeating the same details until I was no longer sure which parts I had already said. The detective was patient. He explained that repetition was useful. People sometimes remembered small details during the second or third account. The only additional detail I remembered was the dark mark near the injured man's mouth when he approached me. I had assumed it was a split lip. It probably was. The suspects had already struck him before he asked for the ride. Late that afternoon, the detective told me the man had survived. He had a fractured jaw, several broken ribs, a concussion, and injuries to both wrists from the plastic ties. He was also suffering from exposure after lying beneath the truck in freezing temperatures. He had not been run over. The outer drive tire had been touching the shoulder of his jacket, but the weight of the tractor was not on him. The tire had settled close enough to leave a curved black mark on the fabric. I was released that evening. My company put me in a motel on the other side of Amarillo while they arranged for the tractor to be returned. I did not sleep much. I kept thinking about the moment before I climbed out for the inspection. The air pressure had been full. The engine was running. All I needed to do was push in 2 brake knobs and place the transmission into gear. My tractor had enough torque to move 40,000 pounds of freight from a complete stop. It would not have noticed a human body. A few weeks later, the detective called me with more information. The injured man had known both suspects. The 3 of them had come to Amarillo together from another part of Texas. They were involved in a planned theft connected to a drug transaction at the motel. The details changed depending on which person was speaking, but the basic story was that a large amount of cash had gone missing from one of the rooms. The man in the tan jacket had taken it. He had tried to leave before the other 2 realized what he had done. That was why he approached me. He was not stranded because his brother had abandoned him. He was attempting to escape the motel before the others found him. The $200 he offered was real. Police found more cash sewn into the lining of his jacket after he reached the hospital. When he walked away from my truck, the pickup followed him. The motel cameras showed him entering a rear stairwell. The suspects caught him on the 2nd floor and forced him into a room. They beat him, tied his hands, and questioned him about the missing money. At some point, he told them about the eastbound truck. He said I was going to Oklahoma City after sunrise. The suspects knew which tractor he meant because they had seen him speaking to me. According to the detective, the idea of putting him beneath the truck came from the heavyset man. They did not have some intelligent plan to make the death look completely accidental. The bindings alone would have made that impossible. Their thinking was much simpler. They wanted someone else to perform the physical act. They believed I would wake up in the dark, start the truck, and drive forward without looking underneath it. By the time anyone discovered what had happened, my tractor would be on Interstate 40. Even if investigators eventually determined that the man had been placed there deliberately, the suspects expected the immediate confusion to give them time to leave Amarillo. They also knew that a loaded tractor could destroy physical evidence. The detective said one of them had described it as letting the truck finish it. I never learned which one said that. The injured man admitted his role in the events at the motel and faced charges of his own after recovering. He was not an innocent person. He had stolen money, participated in the original scheme, and lied to me about why he needed a ride. None of that meant he deserved to be crushed beneath a truck. Both suspects eventually accepted plea agreements on charges connected to the kidnapping and attempted killing. The heavyset man received the longer sentence because investigators believed the plan had been his. The second man also received decades in prison. I was asked to provide a written statement, but did not have to testify. The video, the emergency call, the physical evidence beneath the truck, and the injured man's account were enough. My company replaced the damaged passenger window and returned the tractor to me several days later. Before I drove it away, I performed a full inspection. When I reached the passenger side drive tires, there was still a faint black mark on the outer tire where the man's jacket had touched it. The mark was only a few inches above the pavement. That was how close he had been. If I had pushed in the brakes before getting out of the cab, the police report would have said that I killed him. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, there are places that don't show up on any tourist map, places the locals won't talk about, places park employees quietly avoid, and places where the people who go in looking for answers usually come back out with something much worse. In tonight's video, I've got 2 stories from that part of the world. In the first one, a state wildlife biologist gets assigned to survey a remote hollow where the numbers coming out of the woods have never added up. And when he finally figures out why, he's going to wish he hadn't. And in the second story, a trail worker takes a 6-week contract in the most isolated section of a national park. A section the park rotates workers through fast and never explains why. And by the end of his first month, he's going to understand exactly why nobody ever does that section twice. Both of these men were professionals. Both of them knew those mountains better than almost anyone. And both of them walked away from careers they loved because of what was waiting for them out there. But before we get into it, if you're a fan of scary stories, you're in the right place. Please hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a story. We post new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Drop a comment down below and let me know which of tonight's 2 stories got under your skin the most. And if you'd rather listen on the go, or for sleep, follow the Just Creepy podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Alright, let's get into the stories. For 11 years, I worked as a wildlife biologist for the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources, operating out of the Marion Field Office in Smith County. Most of that work would bore you. I aged deer at check stations. I trapped and collared black bears. I sat through public meetings where retired men yelled at me about coyotes. I wrote reports that maybe 4 people ever read. It was a good job, and I was good at it. And for most of those 11 years, I believed that the woods in my district held nothing I couldn't identify, dart, tag, or explain. I want to be careful about how I tell this, because I know how it sounds. I've spent my whole career being the person on the other side of stories like this one. Somebody calls the office swearing they saw a mountain lion, and I'm the one who drives out, looks at the tracks, and tells them it was a bobcat and their fear did the rest. I've explained away black panthers, wolves, and one memorable werewolf that turned out to be a mangy coyote with a hairless tail. I know what people see in the woods at night, and I know what their minds do with it. So understand that everything I'm about to describe, I first tried to kill with every explanation I had. I ran it through 11 years of training. The explanations didn't survive. The thing did. This happened in the fall of 2022 in Scott County, Virginia, in a drainage off the Clinch River between Dungannon and Fort Blackmore. The locals call it Grassy Branch, after the creek that runs through the bottom of it. It's a steep, closed-in hollow, maybe 900 acres of hardwood and rhododendron running back from the river into the flank of the mountain, and almost all of it belongs to one landowner. There's a single gated logging road in, one old clearing about 2/3 of the way up where a homestead used to stand, and past that, nothing. No trails, no leases, nobody hunts it. That last part is what put it on my desk. Chronic wasting disease had been moving through Virginia's deer herd for years by then, and the department was expanding its surveillance zones. If you don't know what chronic wasting disease is, it's a prion disease. It eats holes in a deer's brain over the course of months. An infected deer loses weight, loses coordination, loses its fear of people, and dies, and there is no cure, and no vaccine and no live test that's practical at scale. The way we tracked it was through numbers, harvest data, check station samples, roadkill collection, and camera surveys, population counts, in and out, year over year. If the numbers in an area started behaving strangely, we looked closer. The numbers around Grassy Branch had been behaving strangely for a long time. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of thing only a person who stares at spreadsheets for a living would ever notice. The properties bordering that hollow produced normal harvest numbers, normal buck-to-doe ratios, normal everything, with one exception. Deer wearing ear tags or collars from our regional studies had a habit of dropping out of the data when their movement tracks crossed into that drainage. Not all of them. But over 15 years we'd had 6 collared deer go into Grassy Branch and stop transmitting, and 0 collared deer come out. Collars fail all the time. But 6 for 6 is not failure. 6 for 6 is a pattern. There was one more thing, and I only found it because I went digging through the old files. A district technician named Harold Slemp had run a camera survey on the edge of that property back in 2009. His summary sheet was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph said the survey was terminated early due to equipment problems. The second paragraph said, and I'm quoting it word for word because I've read it a few hundred times since, "Count data from this site could not be reconciled and should not be used. Recommend excluding this drainage from future survey rotation." Could not be reconciled. In 11 years of reading survey summaries, I had never seen anybody write that. Counts come out messy, sure. You write low confidence. You write estimate only. You don't write that the numbers cannot be reconciled, because that sentence doesn't mean the data is bad. It means the data is impossible. I should have called Harold right then. He was retired by that point, living over in Chilhowie. Instead, I did what I always did, which was assume the guy before me was sloppy, and put Grassy Branch on my survey list for October. The landowner was a woman named Ruth Compton. She was in her 80s, and she lived alone in a brick house near the mouth of the hollow. And when I called her about access, she didn't ask me a single question about the survey. Most landowners want to know everything. What the cameras see, whether we share pictures, whether this means the state is coming for their property. Ruth Compton asked me nothing. She said I could put up whatever I wanted, and then she said the only thing she ever really said to me, which was that the gate got locked at dark, and I'd want to be on the right side of it when it did. I took that as an old woman being particular about her gate. I signed her access form, took the spare key she kept in a coffee can on the porch, and drove up the logging road for the first time on the 4th of October. I want to describe the hollow honestly, without dressing it up, because in daylight there was nothing wrong with it. It was pretty. The road ran along Grassy Branch through big tulip poplars and white oaks, and the creek was clear, and the leaves were starting to turn. Squirrels everywhere. Good mast crop that year, acorns crunching under the tires. The old clearing at the top was about 4 acres of broom sedge and goldenrod with a collapsed chimney standing in the middle of it, and the deer sign around it was heavy. Trails pressed into the grass, fresh droppings, rubs on the cedars at the woodline. As deer habitat, it was excellent. Whatever instinct is supposed to warn you about a place, mine said nothing that first day. I've thought about that a lot since. Either the feeling people describe is a myth, or the hollow knew how to be quiet. I hung 8 cameras. 5 around the clearing covering the main trails, 2 on the creek crossings below it, and 1 high on the ridge saddle where the deer moved over into the next drainage. Standard grid, infrared flash, no visible light, batteries good for months, cards big enough to hold tens of thousands of images. I set them all to take 3 photo bursts with a 30-second delay, checked my angles, locked the gate behind me, and left. The whole visit took 4 hours, and it was the last normal day I ever spent in that place. I came back to pull the cards on the 25th of October. Card checks are usually the fun part of the job. It's Christmas morning for wildlife people. You never know what walked past. I sat in my truck at the bottom of the hollow with a card reader and a laptop and started with the clearing cameras. And for the first 20 minutes, everything was exactly what it should have been. Fawns feeding in the broom sedge. A decent 8-point buck working a scrape. Turkeys. A bear that had smelled the camera and given it a long, offended look. Thousands of images, and all of them ordinary. The count problem showed up when I started doing the actual work. The main group using that clearing was a doe herd, 14 animals. I got to know them well over the following weeks, but even on that first card pull, they were easy to track as a unit because of a mature doe with a torn left ear who always led them in. They fed through the clearing most evenings. The camera coverage was good enough that I could watch the whole group enter from the north wood line, feed across, and exit south toward the creek. And because I'm the kind of person who counts things, I counted them. In and out, every pass. 14 deer walked into that clearing. 13 walked out. The first time I saw it, I assumed I'd missed an animal in the frame edges, or one had doubled back out of coverage. That's normal. Deer aren't marching bands. But it kept happening, not every night. Every third or fourth night, the group entered with 14 and left with 13. And then, a few nights later, they'd enter with 14 again. The herd size never actually dropped. No matter how many times the count came up one short on the way out, the next entry was 14. I want you to sit with how wrong that is, because I don't think it lands unless you've done this work. If a herd loses an animal, the herd is smaller. If a predator takes one, you find sign. A kill site, drag marks, scavengers. I walked that clearing and the woods around it on my next visit, and I walked it hard, a full grid search over 2 days, and I found nothing. No carcasses, no bones, no hairbeds where coyotes had worked something over. Stranger than that, no vultures. And there are always vultures in Scott County in October. In 2 days of searching, I never saw a single one over that hollow. I noted it in my field book on the 27th of October, and I remember exactly what I wrote, because it was the first sentence I ever wrote about Grassy Branch that scared me a little to put on paper. I wrote, "No scavenger activity observed in drainage. None. Deer don't disappear without feeding something. Everything in the woods gets eaten. That's the whole arrangement. Unless the thing that took them wasn't leaving anything behind, or wasn't taking them to eat at all. I told myself it was a counting artifact. I told myself a doe was slipping out through a coverage gap. I moved 2 cameras to close the gaps, and while I was in the images fixing my counts, I found the second problem, and the second problem was worse. I found it because of the burn-in. When you review thousands of photos from a fixed camera, the background becomes wallpaper. Same trees, same chimney, same slope of grass, frame after frame, until your eyes stop seeing it at all. You're looking at the deer in the foreground, because the deer are what changes. It took me somewhere north of 4,000 images before my eye finally snagged on the thing in the background that never changed. And once I saw it, I couldn't understand how I'd missed it, and I've never fully trusted my own eyes since. At the far north end of the clearing, at the absolute limit of the infrared flash, right at the ragged edge where the image grain dissolves into the dark, there was a deer standing at the wood line. Head up, body facing the camera, every night. It was in the background of the herd photos. It was in the background of the buck photos. It was there behind the turkeys, and there behind the bear. Not in every frame, but in every night, somewhere, at that same distance, at the edge of at least one camera's reach. Always standing in the open just enough to register, always facing the lens. That alone wouldn't have meant much. Deer stare at cameras. The infrared isn't as invisible as the manufacturers claim, and a sharp-eyed doe will pick up the glow of the sensor and lock onto it. I've got thousands of photos of deer staring straight down the barrel. But those deer stare and then they go back to feeding. Because a deer is a stomach with legs, and October is the eating season, and no wild animal spends its night doing nothing. So I did what I do. I quantified it. I went back through every card and pulled every frame that had the background deer in it, and I put them in their own folder. And when I was done, that folder had 611 images spanning 20 nights. And in 611 images, that animal never once had its head down, never fed, never browsed a twig, never turned broadside, never bedded, never did one single thing a deer does. It stood at maximum distance, with its head up and its body oriented on the camera. And the only thing that ever changed between frames was that sometimes it was 3 or 4 steps farther left or right, repositioned, the way you'd move to keep an angle on something. I measured it too, because measuring is how I stay calm. There was a cluster of saplings at the north wood line that showed in the frames, and I'd walked past them, so I knew their height. Scaling off those saplings, the animal stood about 41 inches at the shoulder. That's big for a doe in Southwest Virginia. That's the top of the range. And it was the same 41 inches in every camera it appeared in, which told me it was one animal, one individual, holding the far edge of my survey grid every single night for 3 weeks, watching the cameras watch the deer. I remember closing the laptop in the truck and sitting there with my thumb on the card reader, and the thought I had was not a frightened thought. It was worse than that. It was the flat professional thought I'd have about any animal, and it just came up on its own, the way training does. The thought was, that's not vigilance, vigilance scans. That's surveillance, surveillance holds. And then underneath it, quieter, it knows where every camera is. I drove back up on the 2nd of November to move cameras and do the grid search I mentioned, the one that found nothing dead. That was also the visit where the hollow stopped pretending in small ways. The first thing was camera 4. Camera 4 sat on a white oak covering the main creek crossing, strapped at chest height, and when I walked up on it, it was facing the tree, not knocked sideways. Facing the trunk, lens an inch from the bark, and the strap was still buckled. Bears mess with cameras constantly. A bear will chew a camera, claw it, rip it off the tree, and carry it 40 yards to die in a laurel thicket. I've recovered cameras with canine punctures clean through the housing. What a bear does not do is unbuckle a nylon strap, rotate the camera housing around the tree, and buckle the strap back. And that strap was rebuckled. I know because I buckle my straps on the 3rd hole, every camera, every time, out of pure habit, and this one was buckled on the 4th. Somebody, and I was still saying somebody at that point, had taken it off, turned it to face the bark, and put it back on, one hole loose. The card told me when. The last real image on camera 4 was time-stamped 11 minutes after I'd locked the gate on my previous visit. 11 minutes after I left the hollow, something walked to that camera. The final frames were the 3-shot burst it fired, as whatever it was came in close. And I want to describe those frames carefully, because they're the reason I stopped sleeping well that fall. The first frame of the burst showed the crossing, empty, and at the top edge of the image, at the far side of the creek, 4 legs, just legs, entering the frame, the body above them cut off by the top of the image. The legs were wrong. I've looked at more deer legs than any person should. A deer's hind leg has a hock that points backward, and people who don't know anatomy sometimes think deer knees bend the wrong way, and they're mistaken. It's an ankle. It's all normal. I've explained it at 100 check stations. I could not make these legs normal. The joints sat too high, and the front legs bent where deer legs don't have a joint at all. A soft flex in the middle of the cannon bone. In the straight part, the part that is one solid bone and cannot bend. In a still photo, not a trick of motion blur. The leg was at rest, planted in the creek gravel, bent in the middle of the bone. The second frame was corrupted. Gray digital smear across most of the image. The kind of artifacting you get from a failing card, except this card tested fine before and after, and the only corrupted frames it ever produced were the ones with that thing close to the lens. Through the smear, you could see a shape filling the frame, pale, and one dark round spot near the top that I have decided was not an eye, because deciding otherwise doesn't help me. The third frame was bark. Camera 4 spent the next 19 days photographing the tree it was strapped to, firing on schedule every time a squirrel moved, and I scrolled through 19 days of oak bark knowing that the whole time, my survey had a hole in it exactly where the creek crossing was, and that the hole had been put there on purpose 11 minutes after I left. I say I was still saying somebody. Here is why that comfort didn't survive the afternoon. It rained hard on the 30th of October, and the creek bank below camera 4 was soft, clean mud, and it held everything that had crossed since the rain. I found my own boot prints going in. I found raccoon, bobcat, one bear, and deer, lots of deer, and crossing the softest stretch of that bank, walking a straight line to the camera tree and away from it, I found deer tracks that measured almost 5 inches long, spread wide at the toe, pressed deep, in a walking pattern where the tracks fell in single file, one print directly in front of the other, a tightrope line. Deer don't walk like that. Deer have a wide chest, and their left and right tracks land on the left and the right. A big buck's trail might narrow, but it never becomes a single line. Foxes walk a near-perfect line. Cats do. Things that stalk do. What I had was a line of deer prints laid down the way a predator walks, straight to my camera, and straight back, and no human boot print anywhere near it. I stood on that creek bank, and I did the thing you do, which is look up and check the wood line, and the woods gave me nothing back. And for the first time in my career, I felt watched in a way I couldn't argue myself out of, because for once, I had the data. 611 photographs of the watcher. I pulled camera 4 entirely, reset the others, and I was at the gate with it locked behind me a full hour before dark, and I sat in my truck on the county road for a minute with my hands on the wheel. And then I drove to Chilhowie and knocked on Harold Slemp's door. Harold was in his 70s, and when I told him where I'd been running cameras, he didn't say anything for a while. He didn't ask what I'd found. That was the tell, the same as Ruth Compton never asking. People who don't know that hollow ask questions. People who know it don't want the answers repeated in their kitchen. I laid it out anyway. The counts. 14 in, 13 out, 14 in again. The background animal. The camera turned to the tree. He listened to all of it looking at the table, and when I finished, he told me 2 things, and they're the only dialogue from this whole account that I'll quote, because they're the only words that mattered. He said, "The count's not wrong. You're counting 14 going in because 14 go in. There's 13 deer in that group." And when I asked him what he meant, he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "Pull your cameras in daylight. Don't sit that hollow after dark. It lets the cameras alone mostly, because cameras leave. You sit there in the dark, you're something new, and it comes to look at new things." 13 deer in a 14 deer group. I drove home, and I opened the folder, and I did the thing that I would give a fair amount of my remaining years to be able to undo, because you can't unknow a thing like this. I went through the entry photos, the 14 coming in, frame by frame, and I stopped looking at the herd and started looking at each animal. And once you look at them as individuals, you can see it. Every entry, 14 animals. 13 of them feeding, flicking ears, swatting tails, being deer. And one at the back, always at the back, head up, never feeding, holding position at the rear of the group at a fixed distance, the same 41 inches at the shoulder, walking its tracks into the tracks of the deer ahead of it. It wasn't taking one of them. Those nights the count came out 13. It was staying behind. The herd walked out, and it stayed in the dark clearing with my cameras. And the reason I had 611 photos of it standing at the North Wood Line is that the North Wood Line is where it went to stand once it was alone. The herd knew. That was the part I couldn't get past as a biologist, and it's the detail I'd ask you to remember out of everything here. In every frame, the real deer never looked at it. Not once. 6 weeks of imagery, thousands of photos, an animal walking among them close enough to touch, and not one doe ever turned her head toward it, ever flagged, ever blew an alarm. Deer stare at everything. Deer stare at falling leaves. The only thing in those woods they refused to look at was the thing walking at the back of their own group, and prey animals only act that way around something they cannot afford to acknowledge. They weren't fooled. They were behaving. It moved with them because they didn't dare do anything about it. and it fed on something out there, on some schedule, because every few weeks, quietly, the torn ear doe's group had a new young doe in it that I didn't recognize, and I stopped trying to figure out where the previous ones went. There's one more thing that happened before the night in the blind, and it matters, because it's the only time I ever saw it in daylight, and daylight is supposed to be where explanations live. On the 7th of November, I went up at noon to swap batteries and reposition 2 cameras. Bright, cold, cloudless day. Frost gone off the grass by the time I reached the clearing. I'd made myself a rule after the creek bank, which was that I moved fast. I kept the truck close, and I kept my head up, and I was following the rule. Standing at camera 2 on the east edge of the clearing with the housing open in my hands, when I got the feeling of a presence that everyone who works outdoors knows, the ordinary one, the one that usually turns out to be a squirrel judging you. I looked up across the clearing, and at the far side, standing in the broom sedge about 80 yards out in full sun, there was a deer. Nothing about the first glance was wrong. That's the thing I need you to understand about this animal, and I think it's the reason the whole region has stories about it. The first glance is fine. Your eye takes in deer shape, deer color, deer size, and files it, and moves on. And it's the second glance that ruins you, because the second glance is when the details start arriving in the wrong order. It was facing me straight on, and it was too still. Deer are never still. Even a deer locked onto danger is a system of small motions, ears swiveling independently, tail twitching, skin shivering off flies, nostrils working. This one stood the way furniture stands. The ears never moved once. In the cold, I could see my own breath, and the herd animals I'd watched that fall all steamed at the muzzle, and across 80 yards of clean November air. This one produced nothing. No breath. I stood there holding a camera housing and doing arithmetic about that. I had my binoculars around my neck, 10 power. I raised them slowly, and I found it, and the glass did what glass does, which is take away the distance that was letting me stay calm. The coat was almost right. That's the best I can say about it. The color sat correctly along the back and went wrong at the edges, at the brisket and the legs, where it thinned out in a way that suggested the coat was a surface rather than a pelt. And I'm aware that sentence doesn't fully make sense, and I've never found a better one. The face is what I remember. A deer's eyes sit on the sides of its skull, because a deer is prey, and prey buys vision in a circle so nothing can come from behind. It's one of the first things you learn, and one of the last things you'd ever think to check, because it's never once been worth checking. Both of its eyes were on the front of its face, set forward, under the brow, spaced the way a predator's eyes are spaced, the way a wolf's are, the way mine are, and both of them were pointed at me with the specific weighted attention that only forward eyes can produce. Side-eyed animals watch you as one input among many. This thing regarded me. There was assessment in it. There was patience in it. And there was something in it that I have only ever seen in one other kind of face. And I'm not going to name the kind, because you already know. And hearing it out loud doesn't help either of us. We stood like that for what my watch later suggested was over 4 minutes. I know I never heard a bird in that time, and the clearing had been full of them when I walked in. I made a decision that I still think was the right one, which was to finish my job. Slowly, with the binoculars back on my chest, I closed the camera housing, buckled the strap on the third hole, and walked, not fast, along the edge of the clearing toward the truck, keeping it at the corner of my vision the whole way, and it stood there and rotated its head to track me. Only the head, the body never shifting its feet, the neck carrying the head around further than it should have gone. And I got in the truck and I looked back through the windshield at the far side of the clearing. 80 yards of open sunlit broom sedge, and it was gone. No motion had crossed the open ground. The wood line was a full 30 yards behind where it had stood. I had looked away for the length of time it takes a man to climb into a pickup. 3 seconds, maybe 4. and in my 4 seconds it had covered 30 yards of dry, frosted grass to the trees without a sound reaching me, or it had done something else. And I've chosen to believe it went to the trees, because the grass in that clearing stood 2 feet high at most, and there was nothing else out there to be behind. I sat in the truck with the engine running and wrote the encounter into my field book with a shaking hand. Time, distance, duration, description, because data is the only prayer I know. Then I drove down, and at the bottom of the hollow I stopped at the gate, and I remember looking at Ruth Compton's brick house through the bare trees, and understanding, in a settled, bone-level way, why every window on the back of that house, the side facing the hollow, had its curtains drawn in the middle of a sunny afternoon. 2 days later, at a check station over in Nicholsville, I aged a buck for a man who'd killed it on the ridge adjoining the Compton land, the far side, outside the hollow. While I worked, he talked, the way hunters do, and without any prompting from me, he said he'd nearly come off that ridge at a run on opening morning, because at first light, a deer had walked out below his stand, and it had stopped, and it had looked up at him, and he'd had deer look at him his whole life, and this was not that, and he'd let it walk, and he'd hunted somewhere else ever since. He laughed when he told it, the way men laugh when they want a thing to be smaller than it was. I didn't laugh, and he noticed I didn't, and he stopped talking, and we finished up with the jawbone in silence. 2 men declining to compare notes, because comparing notes makes a thing official. I'm going to be honest about the next decision, because it was mine, and I own it. Harold told me not to sit the hollow at night, and 8 days later, I sat the hollow at night. I could dress it up as protocol, and there was protocol. The survey design did call for 1 direct observation count, thermal optics, dusk through dawn, to true up the camera data. But I could have skipped it. I wrote the design. The truth is that I had spent 11 years being the man with the explanation, and I could not stand being the man with the folder of photographs instead, and I believed, in the way that has gotten better field people than me killed, that understanding a thing protects you from it. On the 11th of November, I told Ruth Compton I'd be staying the night up at the clearing for a count. She looked at me the way you'd look at weather coming, and she didn't argue, and she didn't lock the gate that night. And I understand now that leaving it open was the kindest thing anyone did for me that whole fall. I set a pop-up ground blind on the south edge of the clearing, tucked back into the cedars, scent control, no light, thermal monocular, notebook, and one thing I'd never once brought on a deer survey in my life, which was my sidearm. I told myself it was for coyotes. Writing that sentence down at the time embarrassed me. It doesn't anymore. The evening was normal for exactly 2 hours and 40 minutes. Deer filtered in around 5. I picked up the torn-ear doe and her group through the thermal, glowing white against the cold ground, and I ran my counts, and the count was 13, and I sat in the dark with that number and felt something in my chest unclench a little. 13 deer, feeding, normal. Maybe the 14th thing had rules. Maybe it didn't come every night. At 9:40, all 13 deer stopped feeding at the same time, not staggered, not one head up, then another. All 13 heads rose in the same second, the way birds turn in a flock, and they held still for maybe half a minute, and then they walked out of that clearing to the south in a fast single line, right past my blind, close enough that I heard their steps in the frost, and there was no snort, no alarm, no flag. Deer that spook make noise about it. These left the way people leave a room when the wrong man walks in. Quiet, immediate, and all at once. And then the clearing was empty, and I did the slow thermal sweep, south to north. And at the north wood line, 40 yards out, standing in the open, there was a shape with the body of a deer, and the body read gray. Cold gray, ground temperature gray. The gray of rocks and logs and dead things, everywhere except the head. The head was white hot, brighter than the deer had been, brighter than any living reading I've ever taken off an animal, a burning white head sitting on top of a cold body, and the head was pointed at my blind. I did not move for 6 hours. I want that to sound harder than it does. 6 hours, mid-November, no heater, no light, holding a monocular to my eye until the eye ached and switching eyes and holding it again, because the alternative was not knowing where it was, and every time I lowered the optic to rest and raised it again, the shape was a little closer. I never saw it take a step. Understand me, I watched that thing more continuously than I have ever watched anything. And it never moved while I was looking, not once. And it was 40 yards away at 9:40, and it was inside 25 yards by 2 in the morning. The gaps were my blinks, my eye changes, the 4 seconds here and there when a man's arms simply give out. It moved inside my 4 seconds. It had all night, and it spent my 4-second gaps closing 15 yards. And I believe it did it that way because it understood exactly what I could see and when, the same way it had understood the cameras all along. Around 3 in the morning, the head tilted. I'll describe it once. The neck turned the head sideways, and the tilt kept going, past the shoulder, past 90 degrees, to an angle where the skull was near upside down. Ears pointing at the frost, and it held that, and the whole time the hot white of the head stayed fixed on my blind. And I understood I was being examined by something that was doing to me exactly what I had been doing to it for 6 weeks, holding the far edge, watching the new thing, taking its count. It never came closer than 25 yards. At the first gray light, when the trees started to have edges again, it turned, and I saw it walk in plain view for the only time, and the gait is the thing I can't file anywhere. Every part of the walk happened in the right order, and each step landed a half beat off the rhythm, joints catching and releasing, the front legs flexing in that mid-bone place where there is no joint, and at the wood line it stopped, and its head came around over its spine, all the way around, to point back at me while its body faced the woods, and it held that for 3 or 4 seconds. Then it walked into the trees, and the sun came up, and I sat in that blind until it was full, hard daylight before I trusted my legs. I pulled all 8 cameras that same morning, every one, straps and all, working fast with my truck backed up the logging road and the driver door standing open. The last camera I pulled was camera 7, which I'd repositioned on my previous visit without telling anyone, including my own field notes. I'd aimed it at the spot where I planned to put my blind. I'd covered my own position, 11 years of habit, and it's the only reason I know the rest. I reviewed that card in my kitchen with the doors locked. Camera 7 had fired all night. It caught me walking in at 4 in the afternoon. It caught the herd pass at 9:40, and at 10 minutes past 6 in the evening, more than 3 hours before the deer ever lifted their heads, more than 3 hours before I found it in the thermal at the north wood line. It caught the shape entering the frame from the south, from behind my blind, and standing still at the edge of the cedars, 11 yards from where I sat facing the blind. It stood there in frame after frame, timestamp after timestamp, 6:10, 6:40, 7:15, 8 o'clock, while I sat 11 yards away running my counts and feeling relieved. It had been behind me the whole evening. The thing I found at the north wood line at 9:40 had not arrived there. It had walked a slow half circle around me to the far side and let the herd out, and then let me find it, at a distance, in the open, because that was where it wanted my attention. I had 6 hours of watching it across a clearing while congratulating myself on never losing it, and the camera says my watch started 3.5 hours after its watch did. The final frames on camera 7, the burst fired closest to the blind, are corrupted. Gray smear, one pale shape. I deleted them, and I'm not sorry, and I delete them again. Here is how it ended, and why you've never read about any of this in a state publication. My official survey report for that drainage, filed the 3rd week of November 2022, says the following. Camera equipment at this site experienced repeated data corruption and one physical disturbance consistent with bear activity. Count data could not be validated. Direct observation was attempted and terminated due to equipment failure. Recommend excluding this drainage from the survey rotation. Could not be reconciled. Recommend excluding. I wrote Harold Slemp's report 13 years after he did, almost word for word, and I finally understood that his 2 paragraphs were never sloppiness. They were a locked gate. Because I sat in my office and thought about what an honest report would set in motion. Follow-up surveys. A graduate student alone hanging cameras. Technicians doing night counts because the data was interesting. Some 24-year-old sitting in a blind in that clearing because a spreadsheet sent them there, the way a spreadsheet sent me. The department runs on curiosity. Everything I could truthfully write was bait. So I falsified a federal adjacent wildlife document, and I would do it again without losing a minute of sleep, because I lose my sleep over other things now. I drove out to return Ruth Compton's gate key the week after I filed it. She took the key, and she asked me nothing, and I told her nothing. And we stood on her porch for a second in that silence, and she nodded at me once, the way you nod at a man who has finally read the sign everybody else read years ago. Her family had held that hollow for over a century, and posted it, and locked it, and let the timber money and the lease money go. Generation after generation, and I used to think land like that was wasted. Now I think the Comptons have been performing a public service since before I was born, and the price of it is that they can never tell anyone what the service is. The Tournier Does group is still up there, I'd guess. 13 deer, the count is 13. It was always 13. I stayed with the department another 2 years, and I never put a camera within 5 miles of that drainage again, and nobody else has either, because the file says there's nothing there worth counting. I do private consulting now, deer density surveys for landowners and hunt clubs, and I'm told I'm thorough. I am. Every survey I run, I count the herd twice. The first count is for the client, and it's the number of animals in the frame. The second count is for me. The second count is how many of them are feeding, how many of them are moving the way weight and bone have to move, how many of them the other deer are willing to look at. The second count is how many of them are deer. So far, the 2 numbers have always matched. On the day they don't, I already know exactly what I'll do, because I've done it before. I'll close the laptop, and I'll write that the data could not be reconciled, and I'll recommend that nobody ever look again. The job posting said 6 weeks, backcountry, solo, and it paid $19 an hour plus a per diem I'd never be anywhere to spend. Trail maintenance in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Hazel Creek drainage, North Carolina side. Clear the winter blowdowns, brush back the corridor, rebuild water bars, report bridge conditions. Housing provided, and the housing was a tent. I was 43 that spring and between lives. I'd cut trees for a living since I was 20, first on wildland fire crews out west, then 15 years as a line clearance arborist around Morganton until the company sold and the new outfit brought their own crews up from Georgia. I had a paid-off truck, a storage unit, and no particular place to be. A man I'd fought fire with told me the park hired sawyers every spring and never had enough of them. I applied on a Tuesday. They called me Thursday morning, which should have told me something. Government jobs don't call back in 2 days unless nobody else wants the job. The orientation was at park headquarters at Sugarlands, outside Gatlinburg, first week of May, 2023. A trail supervisor named Kathy walked me through the radio protocols and the bear protocols and the paperwork. She was friendly and fast, and she had done this speech a lot. Near the end, she slid a map across the table with my section marked in yellow highlighter. Hazel Creek Trail, from the lakeshore up to Bone Valley, plus the Bone Valley Spur, 14 miles of trail, give or take, in the most remote drainage in the park. I asked her the normal question, who had it last season? She looked at the map instead of at me, and said they rotated people through that section, that nobody did it twice, and that it was a scheduling thing. Then she gave me the rest of the packet, and wished me luck. And that was the whole conversation. I have replayed it a few times since. She never lied to me. Rotating people through because nobody will go back is still a rotation. You can't drive to Hazel Creek. That's the first thing to understand about the place. When they built Fontana Dam during the war, the lake drowned the road, and it drowned the bottomland towns with it. Proctor, Judson, Bushnell. Hundreds of families got bought out or forced out, and the government promised to build a road back around the north shore of the lake so people could visit their family cemeteries, and the government never built it. 70 years of never built it. The families that stayed bitter about it had a point. The only way in now is by boat across Fontana, or by walking 20-some miles over the ridges with everything on your back. A man named Denny ran the shuttle out of Fontana Marina, a flat gray John boat with a 50-horse motor and a milk crate for a passenger seat. He hauled me and 11 days of food and a chainsaw and a crosscut and my tools across the lake on the morning of the 8th of May. Flat water, fog coming off it, the mountains standing straight up out of the far shore with no houses on them, and no roads on them and no lights on them at all. Denny didn't talk much, which suited me. When he swung the boat into the mouth of Hazel Creek and cut the motor to drift me into the bank, he looked up the drainage for a second, at the fog sitting in it, and he said the only thing he said that whole ride. He said, "I'm here Tuesdays and Fridays if somebody flags me from the bank. You won't see me otherwise." Then he set my gear on the mud and backed the boat off and was gone, and the sound of the motor went away down the lake, and it got quiet in a way I hadn't heard in years. Not silent, quiet, water moving, a grouse drumming somewhere upslope, wind way up high in the tops. Good sounds. I stood there on the bank of Hazel Creek with a summer's worth of work in front of me, and I remember thinking I'd landed the best job of my life. For the first week, I was right. I set my base camp at Campsite 86 at Proctor, about a half-mile up from the lake. There's a white house standing there in the woods, the old Calhoun house. The last building left from when Proctor was a lumber town of 1,000 people. There's a horse barn the park keeps up, and there are chimneys and foundations back in the trees. And up on the hill there's a cemetery, with fresh plastic flowers on some of the graves. The park runs a ferry once a year for the families, on Decoration Day, and they come across and mow the graves of their people, and put out new flowers and leave. The rest of the year, nobody. I want that fact in your pocket for later. Once a year. The work was the work. I'd saw out the blowdowns from the winter, buck them into rounds, roll them off the trail, cut the brush back an arm's length on both sides, clean the water bars so the spring rains wouldn't eat the treadway. I did it 8 or 9 hours a day, and I did it well, because it's what I know how to do, and a man alone in the woods needs his days to have a shape. Up at first light, coffee, walk to the day's stretch of trail, work until the light went yellow, walk back, cook, hang the food bag on the bear cables, sit by the fire an hour, sleep hard. The trail told me things while I worked, the way trails do. Boot prints from the last backpackers, days old, washing out. Bear sign, hog rooting, tore up ground where the wild hogs had been at the tubers. Turkey scratch. By the third day, I knew everything that was using that corridor, because reading ground is half of what an arborist does, and all of what a fire scout does, and there was nothing on that ground that didn't belong. The first wrong thing was small, and I explained it away, and that's how these things go. You spend the small wrong things the way you spend pocket change, and you don't miss them until you need them all at once. On the morning of the 13th of May, my second Saturday, I walked out to the stretch I'd been cutting, about 2 miles up from Proctor, and my plastic felling wedges were sitting on top of a stump beside the trail, stacked, 3 of them, squared up in a neat little tower on the flat of the stump. I carry 5 wedges. I'd had 5 in my kit bag the night before, in camp, in the vestibule of my tent. I stood there and looked at the 3 on the stump, and then I went through the kit bag and counted, and I had 2 in the bag, and 3 on a stump 2 miles from camp, stacked where I could not miss them. I ran it every way a reasonable man runs a thing. I'd left them. I'd set them there Friday evening and forgotten. Except I hadn't worked that stump Friday. I'd worked past it Thursday. And I don't leave wedges anywhere, ever. Because wedges are the difference between a saw that works and a saw that's pinched in a log 12 miles from a road. It's a habit that lives below my thinking, the same as buckling my chaps. Somebody had come into my camp in the night, opened a kit bag 8 feet from my head, taken 3 wedges, and not the fuel, and not the food, and not the $400 saw, walked them 2 miles up the trail in the dark, and stacked them on a stump for me to find. I told myself it was another hiker with a strange sense of humor. There were no other hikers. I hadn't seen a boot print newer than 4 days in either direction, and I'd have known. I told myself it was me, tired, misremembering. I was neither. But there's no third thing to tell yourself on day 6 of 42, so I put the wedges in the bag, and I went to work, and I saw it all day with the feeling of the woods being slightly different behind me than in front of me. The second thing was the snare. I found it on the 17th, off the Bone Valley Spur, 10 feet up a game trail that crossed the human trail at a low gap. A snare loop, set for hog or deer, anchored to a bent-over hickory sapling. Poachers run snares in the park, it happens. The rangers deal with it. That's not what stopped me. What stopped me was the material and the make. The wire was modern galvanized electric fence wire. Bright, new off a spool. And the knots were nothing. I mean, they were nothing I knew, and I have rigged rope and cable my whole working life. The wire was finished off in a lashing that went around and through itself in a pattern I couldn't follow with my eyes, tight even, done by hands that had made that lashing 10,000 times. It wasn't a poacher's twist and crimp, it was a craft. Somebody's grandfather had taught them that lashing, and his grandfather had taught him. New wire, old hands. I cut the snare out, coiled the wire, packed it out, and wrote it up for the rangers in my notebook. And that night at the fire, I caught myself sitting with my back against the horse barn wall instead of out in the open, and I hadn't decided to do that. My body had decided it. The deer was the 18th of May. 1 day later. I heard it happen, is the thing, or heard something. Deep in the night, up the slope east of camp, there was a single crash of brush, 1 animal's worth, and then nothing. No coyotes after it, no struggle. 1 crash, and the woods went back to the creek sound, and I lay in the tent listening for a long time, and then I slept, because a crash in the brush is nothing. A crash in the brush is every night in the woods. In the morning, 40 yards up that slope, laid out on the leaves where I would cross it on my shortcut to the trail, there was a deer. A young buck, dead, opened up and dressed out, gutted clean, hide gone, back straps and hindquarters gone, head left. And it was the cleanest field dressing I've ever seen, and I've dressed 100 deer, and there was not 1 knife mark on that animal. I got down on my knees in the leaves and looked. Where a blade slips and scores the inside of the ribs, nothing. Where you nick the hide starting your cut, no hide to check, but the membrane along the openings wasn't cut at all. It was parted, pressed apart and torn along lines the way you'd tear a chicken apart with your thumbs, if your thumbs were strong enough, and you'd done it your whole life. There were no drag marks coming in or going out. There was almost no blood on the leaves for what had been done to it. And it had been done in the dark, in silence, 40 yards from where I slept, in the hour after the 1 crash of brush, and then it had been left square across my morning route. Hunters hide their kills from rangers. Poachers pack out fast and leave the guts far from trails. Nobody dresses a deer bare-handed in the dark next to a stranger's camp and displays it. It wasn't a threat. I understood that even then, kneeling next to it with the hair standing up on my arms. A threat would have been the deer on my tent. This was set where I'd find it in good light. Whole story readable, nothing wasted, nothing sloppy. It was closer to a demonstration. Here is what we take. Here is how quietly. Here is how near to you. I got on the radio that evening from the high spot behind the cemetery. the only place in the lower drainage with line of sight to the repeater, and I gave dispatch my scheduled check-in, and I reported the snare, and I started to report the deer, and I heard how it was going to sound before I said it. A dressed-out deer with no knife marks. Sir, how do you know there were no knife marks? Because I knelt in the leaves and looked, ma'am. I gave them the snare and the wedge business and let the deer be possible poaching activity. Will monitor. And dispatch copied it with no interest at all, and told me a ranger patrol would get up Hazel Creek when staffing allowed. And I signed off and stood up there by the graves in the last light with the plastic flowers going gray around me. And that was the first evening I heard the clicking. It came from across the creek, west side, in the laurel. Rhythmic, not woodpecker rhythm, they drum in rolls. This had spacing. It had intention in the spacing, the way a man tapping a table has intention. I stood dead still and listened, and it stopped, and I let out the breath I was holding, and then it answered itself from the east side of the drainage, behind me, upslope. Same pattern. Talk, 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 talk. Two of them. Talking across the valley, over my head, about the thing standing between them in the graveyard. I walked down off that hill in the dusk at a pace just under a run, and I built the fire bigger than I needed it, and I sat with the axe leaned against my leg until past midnight. The clicking never came closer that night. It didn't need to. It had told me what it was for. It was a count. They were counting me, the way I counted deer sign on the trail, and the count came back the same every time. 1. Here is where I should have quit, and I want to be straight about why I didn't. It wasn't courage. Part of it was money. 6 weeks of that pay was the bridge between my old life and whatever came next. And a man who walks off a federal contract in week 2 doesn't get called for week 1 of anything else. Part of it was pride, the stupid kind, the kind that has buried better men than me. And part of it, the part that shames me now, was that I'd decided I understood the situation. Somebody lived back in there. Fine. People had lived in that drainage for 200 years before the government took it, and maybe not every family had come out when the lake went in, and whoever their grandchildren were, they were making a point about whose valley it was. I could respect the point. I'd keep to the trail, work my section, mind my business, and we'd share the woods for 5 more weeks. I built a whole treaty in my head. The other side never signed it. The rest of May they studied me, and I pretended I wasn't being studied. The clicking came most nights, always at the same time. That's the detail that took me too long to add up. Not the same clock time, the same moment in my routine. I'd cook, eat, wash the pot in the creek, hang the food bag, and sit down by the fire. And inside a minute of me sitting down, talk, 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 from one slope or the other. I sat down at different times on different nights. Didn't matter. The clicking was cued to me, to my body settling, which meant that every single evening, before I ever heard a thing, somebody was already in position on the slope, watching me eat. I tested it once, banked the fire, zipped into the tent loud, then lay there in my boots for 2 hours and eased back out with no light. I stood in the black by the cold fire ring and heard, 40 or 50 yards out in the dark, one careful footstep. Then nothing more for as long as I could stand to stand there. Whoever it was could wait longer than I could. That was true every night, and both of us knew it. Food went missing in weights too small to swear to. A handful of rice, 2 tortillas out of a pack of 10. The bare cables hold a bag 20 feet up and 10 feet out, and nothing on 4 legs was getting at it, and the knots I tie off with were retied, not cut, retied, in that same over and through lashing from the snare. They could have taken it all. They took a tax. The tracks came after the rain, the night of the 26th of May. It rained hard from supper time to past midnight, a real mountain soaker, and a rain that hard wipes every mark off the ground. Every print on that trail the next morning was new since midnight, which is why I can tell you what I'm about to tell you with no hedging at all. I'd rebuilt a run of water bars that week on the grade above the forks, and I'd raked the treadway out smooth between them, 40 yards of clean dirt, and when I walked up onto that stretch in the morning, the clean dirt had traffic on it, bare feet, human bare feet, and I got down on my heels in the trail the way I'd knelt by the deer, and I stayed down there a long time. 2 adults and a small one. The adult prints ran better than 11 inches heel to toe, and they were wide in a way you don't see anymore. The toes splayed full out, each toe printing separate and strong, the whole forefoot pressed broad. Shoes make a foot. A foot that never wore them makes itself, and these feet had never worn them. No arch to speak of. Heavy callus, you could read it in the flat even pressure at the edges where a soft foot shows light. They'd come down the mountain in the dark, in the rain or right behind it, walking my raked trail single file the way they walked everything. And the small prince, a child's, 7 or 8 years old by the size, ran sometimes in file with the others, and sometimes straight out to the trail edge and back, the way a kid drifts and gets called in. There was a spot where the child's prince stopped and turned and stood, both feet planted, toes pointed downhill toward Proctor, toward my camp. Somebody small had stopped in the dark on my clean trail and looked down the mountain at where I slept, and then the big prince came back for it, and they went on. They were using my work. That was the part that sat me down on a rock, with the rain still dripping out of the trees. A month of my labor, every blowdown bucked, every stretch brushed out, and the first clean night after a rain showed me who I'd been working for. They moved on my trail because I'd made it quiet to move on. I'd been improving the roads of their country since the 8th of May, and they had watched me do it the way you'd watch a man paint your fence. And the wedges and the rice and the tally at the fire were how they'd talked about me among themselves the whole time. Not a threat. Livestock management. I was something that had wandered in, and I was useful, and I was fed, and I was watched. And the question they were still turning over, click by click across the valley every night, was what I was for when the work ran out. The backpackers came through 2 days later, the 28th, the only human beings I saw in 33 days. A young couple out of Knoxville doing a loop over from Eagle Creek, good gear, sunburned, happy. They stopped where I was cutting, and we talked the way you talk in the backcountry, water levels and bear activity, and where they'd camped. They'd spent the night before at campsite 83, up Bone Valley, the deep one, and the girl said the strangest thing, laughing while she said it. She said they'd been kept up half the night by owls. I asked what the owls were doing. She said, talking to each other, one on each side of the creek, back and forth for hours. Her boyfriend hadn't heard it. He'd slept, and she'd lain awake listening to the 2 owls trade calls across the water. And she said the part that stayed with her was that they took turns so politely, never once called over each other. And sometime deep in the night the calls had moved, both of them together, down the valley, in the direction of Proctor, and faded out, and she'd finally slept. She told the whole thing as a nice story about nature, and I stood there with my saw ticking as it cooled, and let it be a nice story about nature, because what was I going to say? That owls don't hold conversations. That barred owls call in rolling bursts, and don't alternate in patient measured turns for hours. That what she'd listened to was a tally being run on her and the boy while they slept, 2 watchers trading counts across the creek, and that when the count was done and it came back harmless, the watchers had walked the length of Bone Valley in the black and come down to spend the small hours doing the same for me. I did tell them one thing. I told them the lower trail was rough, and the boat schedule was unreliable, and that if they wanted my advice, they'd push over the ridge to Eagle Creek that same day and be at the lake by evening. It was the only lie of my summer. The trail was in the best shape it had been in years. I'd seen to that myself, and I'd do it again. They thanked me and went, and they were fine, I know because I checked the news for weeks after, and here's what I want you to take from the 2 of them. They spent one night and got counted, and got escorted to the edge of the ledger, and walked out sunburned and happy with a nice story about owls. The valley had rules, and passing through clean was inside the rules. Staying was the violation. Staying and working and sleeping in the same spot night after night, raking their roads and hanging my food on their mountain. A man behaving with the confidence of somebody who believed the ground under him owed him something. Nobody had stayed since Carl Ramey. And once, on the last day of May, in the crack of a rock overhang 100 feet off the Bone Valley spur, wedged in where you'd cache something you meant to come back for, I found a toothbrush. A red plastic toothbrush, sun-faded to pink, and the handle end was chewed. Not puppy chewed. Worked. Gnawed long and thoughtful, the way a man gnaws a pencil, the plastic gone soft-edged and white with tooth marks. Human mouth. Years of a human mouth. I put it back exactly the way it sat, and I have thought about that toothbrush more than about almost anything else in that valley. Somebody had carried it out of the world of drugstores a long time ago, and kept it, and used it until it was ruined, and cached it in dry rock. Whatever they were by now, they had started out as us. The cache under the overhang up the valley was worse. I found it on the 4th of June, following a flagging of orange survey tape I did not hang, tied at eye height on a dogwood limb, leading off trail. I knew better. I followed it anyway, because it was tied in a bow, a shoelace bow, and something about that domestic little bow got past my judgment entirely. 60 yards up the slope, under a granite lip, out of the rain, somebody had laid out a camp's worth of gear in a row. A green external frame pack, mice-eaten, a sleeping bag, rolled, a cook kit, a pair of boots, size 10 or so, standing together, laces tucked in. Boots. A man walks out of these mountains in his boots, or he doesn't walk out. In the pack's top pocket there was a spiral notebook swollen fat with old damp, and on the cover in ballpoint it said C. Ramey, and the pages I could pry apart said the rest. Carl Ramey had my job. The dates in the book were from 2 seasons back. He was a retired school teacher from Silva doing volunteer trail work, and his early pages were bird lists and mileage, and how his knees held up, and then his pages were my pages. Tools moved in the night and set out where he'd find them. Rice gone. A hog snare of bright new wire tied off in knots he drew a picture of because he couldn't describe them, and his drawing matched the lashing I'd cut off the hickory to the turn. The clicking, which he called the tally, which is a better name than mine. His entries got shorter as June went on. The second to last one said he'd asked the boat to come early. The last entry was dated the 9th of June in the evening by his note of it, and it said, "Rain till 4. Cleared the 2 poplars above the forks. The whistling tonight is closer and it has gotten better at." That's it. Midword almost. The pen line runs off the edge of the page. The notebook sat under that rock for 2 years with his boots standing next to it, and no search ever found it because as far as I have ever been able to learn, no search ever happened. And hold that thought too, because it comes back at the end. The whistling he meant started for me that same week, and Ramey was right. The horror of it was exactly that it got better. The first nights it was a fair copy of a Phoebe, except Phoebes don't call in the dark. Then it was a copy of me. I whistle while I file saw chain, an old habit, no tune, just aimless notes. On the 7th of June, from the laurel across the creek, in the full dark, my own aimless filing whistle came back at me, note for note. And then the pitch of it bent, and it came again wrong, on purpose. The notes stretched into a shape that no bird makes and no man would choose, a question mark of a sound. Sound is how they play with you before they close. I know that now. A copied voice in the dark is bait, and it is also practice, and it is also a way of saying, we have listened to you so closely that we can be you, and there is nothing about you we do not have. I was done. Money, pride, treaty, all of it. On the morning of the 8th of June, I got the radio from the cemetery hill and called dispatch and told them I needed the boat moved up, medical, if they had to code it that way. my judgment being that conditions in my section were unsafe for solo work. Dispatch took a long time coming back, and when it came back, it was Kathy herself, my supervisor, on the net at 8 in the morning, and she didn't ask one question. A supervisor always asks questions. Unsafe how? Injured how? Can you continue? Do you copy? Kathy asked nothing. She said Denny couldn't cross until Friday morning, the 10th, weather on the lake. And then there was a gap of air and she said, "Stay at Proctor by the water. Don't work your section tomorrow. Acknowledge." Acknowledge. I acknowledged. I walked down off that hill knowing 3 things. Friday was 2 days away. My supervisor had just told me, in the flattest voice I ever heard her use, to stay out of my own section. And whatever was in the file drawer at Sugarlands about Hazel Creek, it was thick enough that nobody needed my details to believe me. I want to tell you I stayed by the water. What happened was the trees came down. Thursday, the 9th of June, first light, there was a poplar across the trail between my camp and the lake. Green, full-leafed, alive the day before, laid straight across the corridor at chest height, a quarter-mile below Proctor, on the only stretch between me and the pickup bank. No storm in the night. No wind. I walked its root end, and the root ball was tipped up out of ground that had been chopped loose around it, grubbed and cut at the roots with something blunt, and the tree had been pushed. A green poplar that size goes better than a ton. It would take 5 or 6 strong people, and it would take them most of a night, and they had done it without one sound reaching me, and I had slept 200 yards away. A tree across a trail is nothing to a man on foot. You climb over it. I climbed over it. It's what it meant that mattered, and what it meant arrived in full about a minute later, when I came around the next bend and there were 2 more, crossed over each other, and the ground between them was staked. Sharpened hardwood stakes, burnt hard points, driven angled through the gaps a body would use, and brush woven through the whole tangle in that same over and under lashing until it wasn't blowdown at all. It was a fence. I have built fence and I have built fire line, and I know work meant to turn a walking thing when I see it, and it was mine. Built for my size, my reach, faced my direction. Passable, if I forced it, slowly, loudly, bleeding, with both hands busy for 10 minutes in a spot they had chosen. And behind me, up the valley, clear and easy in the morning air, the trail I'd spent a month clearing ran open and smooth toward Bone Valley. That direction, wide open, toward the lake, fenced, herded. The word arrived on its own. Every choice in front of me had been built by somebody else, and every easy step went up valley, away from the water, away from Friday, away from Denny and the gray boat, into the part of the drainage where Carl Ramey's boots stood facing the rock. So I did the one thing that 4 weeks of watching me could not have put in their plans, because I had never once done it in 4 weeks. I stepped off the trail on the creek side, and I went straight down Hazel Creek itself, into the water, and I ran. Not down the corridor, down the drainage. There's a difference, and my life rode on it. The trail swings wide of the creek in the lower mile where the gorge pinches. The creek goes through the pinch, boulders the size of trucks, laurels so thick over the water it goes dusk at noon, ledges you lower yourself off blind into pools you hope are deep. No person herds another person through that, because no person goes through that. And that was the whole calculation. Their game was built on knowing me, and the me they knew was a trail man. And that man stopped existing the second my boots hit the water. They came anyway. I want to be plain about this part, because it's the part I'd give back if I could. When I broke pattern, the valley made its first honest sound in a month. From the slope above the fence, a whistle, loud, no birdsong left in it, and it was answered down valley ahead of me, and answered again across the creek, 3 points, moving, and the clicking started up under the whistles fast and doubled. Talk, 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 talk. No spacing left. No patience left. and for the first time, I heard them move. Brush going over, rock clatter on the far slope, matching my pace. Something crossing the creek behind me, one splash and no more. They were fast in the laurel, faster than I was in the water, and they were silent when they wanted to be, and they weren't wanting it anymore. The tally was over. What ran me down that gorge for the next 40 minutes was a hunt. And every one of those minutes, I understood with a clean, cold, roaring clarity that Carl Ramey's last sentence had no period, because you cannot punctuate the moment the whistling gets close enough. I went off the last ledge above the lake arm without checking the pool, dropped 9 or 10 feet in a crash of white water, came up swimming with the pack dragging me down, and my shins opened up on rock, and I hauled out on the far side of the creek mouth onto the Drowntown Flats where the timber thins, and the lake was in front of me, wide and gray and blessed and empty, and I turned around once. They stop at the open ground. That's what I saw, and it's the only clear sight of them I ever got, and it was enough. Back at the tree line above the flats, in the deep shade, 3 figures stood in the laurel edge, upright, man-shaped, man-sized, pale where the skin showed and not much showed, and utterly, absolutely still, the way herons are still. 60 yards of open flat between us, morning sun on it, and they would not cross it, and I stood dripping and bleeding in the light, knowing that the sun and the open ground were the entire remaining sum of my safety, and that they knew it too, and had known it for a month, and that everything that had happened in that valley had happened inside their rules, until the creek. One of them raised a hand. I raised mine to hikers on the trail, first 2 fingers off an imaginary hat brim, a habit from 30 years of right-of-way work. It raised its hand and gave me my own wave, exact. First 2 fingers, tip of the brim, and then the 3 of them were not there. I didn't see them go. The laurel didn't move. They were simply subtracted, and the woods stood there being ordinary, and I walked backward halfway across that flat before I could make myself turn around. Denny's boat came at 7 the next morning, a day early, no explanation, and I have wondered since whether Kathy sent him against the weather, or whether Denny just knew, because he ran the bow up on the mud and looked at my shins wrapped in duct tape and a spare shirt, and looked at me, and said nothing at all, and hauled me and 1 pack across the lake. My saws stayed at Proctor, cached in the horse barn, tagged with my name. For all I know, they're still there. I wasn't going back up for them, and here's the thing, nobody asked me to. A federal chainsaw is paperwork. Nobody ever asked. At Sugarlands on Monday, I sat across from Kathy with a resignation form that was already printed when I walked in, my name already typed on it. She slid it over. Personal reasons, the box already checked. I signed it, and she took it back and squared it on the desk, and for a second she stopped being a supervisor. She asked me if I was hurt. I said not really. She nodded, and she said the last thing anyone in that park ever said to me about it. She said, "The section's coming off the maintenance schedule. It'll go to natural condition. It should have gone years ago. Natural condition. That's the term of art for a trail the park stops maintaining and lets the mountain take back. No trail crew, no volunteers, no solo sawyers sleeping at Proctor." I looked it up the following spring, and sure enough, the park's trail bulletin listed Hazel Creek above the forks and all of Bone Valley as closed for resource protection, no projected reopening, and I sat with my coffee in a kitchen in Morganton and understood that I was reading a treaty, the real one, the one where the other side sets the terms, the way they'd been setting them all along, and some ranger above Kathy's pay grade signs it every year by leaving a drawer closed, and the drawer has Carl Ramey in it, and it has whoever was before him, and it very nearly had me, and the park's side of the treaty is the same as mine was, minus the arrogance. Keep to your ground, mind your business, share the woods. I do line clearance work again, private contract, towns and highways, sodium lights and traffic noise, and I have learned to love every ugly decibel of it. I don't camp anymore. My hands still know the work and my legs still want the mountains, and I do not go. But I'll leave you where I told you I would, back at that cemetery on the hill above Proctor with the plastic flowers, because that's the detail that finished it for me. The park ferries the families across once a year, on Decoration Day, at the end of May. And that's the only day the graves get tended. Everybody agrees on that. It's in the park literature. I was in that valley from the 8th of May to the 10th of June, and Decoration Day came while I was there, and no ferry ran, because I'd have seen it, and Denny would have hauled it, and no soul came up that hill past my camp, because nothing came up that trail in daylight all month that I didn't read on the ground the next morning. And in the second week of June, on the oldest graves at the back, the ones with the stones worn down to bare shapes, the ones the visiting families walk past to get to their own people, the flowers were fresh, not plastic, cut, mountain laurel and flame azalea, tied in little bunches with strips of green bark, laid at the base of 11 stones with the tenderness you'd use on your grandmother's grave, and the bark strips were finished off in a lashing that went around and through itself in a pattern I could have tied myself by then, with my eyes shut. They come down at night and tend their dead. They've been doing it for 70 years, since the water took the towns and the government broke its promise about the road, and the families that ride the ferry once a year walk right past the proof and see decoration, and the park mows around it and sees nothing. And I stood among those graves on my last morning in the valley and finally understood the treaty in full. They stayed. When the lake came up and everybody signed and got on the trucks, some families walked up instead of out, into the laurel, into the ravines and the rock, out of the ledger, and their children were born up there, and their children's children run the tally on whatever sleeps at Proctor, and they bury their own in ground the government thinks it owns, one ridge over from graves the government admits to, and they lay flowers. That's who counted me every night for a month. Not monsters, the neighbors, the oldest neighbors in those mountains, holding the oldest grudge, keeping the only appointments that still matter to them. And the reason I'm alive to type this is that I finally quit trespassing and got in the boat. The section's off the schedule now. Nobody maintains it. That's not true though, is it? Somebody maintains it. They always have. It just was never the trail they were maintaining. It was the border.